It was nearly dusk when Bronn first caught sight of the slender shape of the starry September looming above the rooftops of King's Landing. Like a dour sentinel, it cast a somber silhouette against the ruddy sky. He pulled on the reins of his horse. Though his station had elevated him beyond the rank of a mere mercenary, Bronn's heart still churned with the same pragmatic cunning that had guided him through every dark alley and quiet deal in the city. This twilight, a swirl of uncertain plans wrestled in his mind. Of late, the world seemed to spin on the whims of pious men. One name on everyone's lips was the High Sparrow, a humble man clad in tattered robes, who somehow had the entire city dancing to the tune of his devotions. Bronn had never been one for the gods, old or new, but he was a man for survival, and for coin. Now, in the hush of the settling evening, he found himself thinking that perhaps there was yet another way to survive, another way to keep a step ahead, even if it meant stooping to new compromises in the gloom beneath King's Landing. He guided his mount through the winding back streets. Somewhere behind the grand facade of the city's nobility lay the labyrinth of corridors, taverns, and forgotten tunnels Bronn knew almost better than his own name. The city's underbelly was once his kingdom, back when every blade could be bought for half a crown, and every rumor was worth its weight in gold. To think the High Sparrow, a figure so publicly righteous, could have such a deep interest in these catacombs of vice and secrecy. Bronn found it both amusing and strange, but he was rarely surprised by contradictions. The holiest men often needed the darkest services, and the darkest men often needed the facade of Holy Shield to survive. If the High Sparrow needed knowledge of the underworld to make examples of King's Landing sinners, well, what better way to find a guide than to conscript the city's most infamous sellsword? Bronn had walked a fine line ever since Tyrion Lannister's departure from the city. Once he might have been a mere lackey, a sword for hire who flitted from one lord's side to the next. But fortunes changed. The nobility rose and fell as swiftly as a wave upon Blackwater Bay. Bronn had learned long ago that alliances were but stepping stones. One day he stood guard beside the heir to Casterly Rock. Another day, he might slip into an alley to parley with some unknown figure who held the promise of coin. Enough coin to ensure a lavish castle or a comfortable seat in a place of power. Perhaps enough coin to buy a name for himself. But coin was not always the payment he sought. Sometimes, survival was itself the commodity. In King's Landing, to survive was to thrive. He dismounted near a crooked lamppost whose glass lantern flickered like a dying star. The horse blew impatiently. Bronn muttered a wordless reassurance, took the reins in his calloused hand, and guided the animal into a deserted stable. It belonged to a man who owed him a few favors, one of many. The stable master, a gaunt fellow named Harris, peered through the gloom. His eyes recognized Bronn, and a quick nod passed between them. No words needed. Harris had once been saved by Bronn from a gang of gold cloaks eager to punish him for feeding starving orphans instead of handing them over for punishment. Ever since that strange altercation, Harris' loyalty had lingered. He had no idea about the true scope of the deals Bronn cut, nor did he care. A small measure of trust was enough. Leaving his horse in the stable, Bronn navigated a claustrophobic alley where flickering torches sputtered on the stone walls. He recalled the High Sparrow's request. Their last meeting had been in a modest corner of the Great September of Baelor, a time when Bronn had half expected the man to condemn him for his sins. Instead, the High Sparrow had quietly insinuated that if Bronn, with his unique knowledge of the city's seamy underside, could help rid the streets of what the faith deemed immoral influences, a better future might dawn on the city. Bronn bit back a laugh just thinking about it. Of course, the High Sparrow wanted to rid the city of sin. But in Bronn's experience, sin was the lifeblood of King's Landing. If there was to be a purge, there would be no end to the list of criminals, brigands, smugglers, courtesans, half-trained assassins, and scrupulous mummers and bribable gold cloaks. Those words from the High Sparrow had sown a single question in his mind. Why me? He recalled the man's quiet, measured voice, a voice that nonetheless could command thousands to riot in the name of the Seven. You have walked these streets more than the noblest lords. You have smelled the filth in the gutters as I have. Help me root out corruption. The High Sparrow had said, And your reward shall be your redemption. By the 7 you can find new purpose. Redemption, he'd called it. Bronn stifled a sneer at the memory. Still, redemption might be worth a thought if it could come with certain material comforts. A man like the High Sparrow wasn't ignorant of the ways of the world. For all his piety, he manipulated the faithful with surgical precision. If Bronn had taught himself anything, it was this: never underestimate the power of cunning, no matter the form it took. A pair of silent beggars slunk away from him as he emerged into a broader street. The evening gloom deepened. Shadows clung to the corners as though the entire city held its breath. The High Sparrow had arranged a discreet meeting by the ruins of a half-burned building. It had once been a brothel, rumored to be favored by unscrupulous men of House Tyrell. The faith militant had set it ablaze in righteous indignation. The scorched timbers still jutted skyward like charred bones. There, away from the watchful eyes of the city's aristocracy, Bronn would find a congregation of devout faithful prostrating themselves for forgiveness, for they had once sought sinful pleasures in that same establishment. Or so the rumors went. For Bronn, those pleas for absolution were pointless. He had come for a job, plain and simple. If the High Sparrow had a new target or some bit of knowledge to share, Bronn would glean it. For a time, at least, he was willing to play the pious man's game. He scanned the remnants of the building. Indeed, a small throng of rag-wearing penitents formed a half-circle around a figure who prayed at the blackened threshold. The figure wore the same humble garb as the rest of them. A threadbare robe, a rope belt, sandaled feet caked in dust. But as Bronn drew near, he recognized the posture. The squared shoulders, the calm stillness, the sense that an entire city's weight rested invisibly on his back. The High Sparrow did not look up when Bronn halted a short distance away. "We come to ask forgiveness for the sins committed here," the High Sparrow said softly, his voice carrying in the hush. "Sins of the flesh, sins of avarice, sins that tie men to their darkest impulses." He let out a breath that was more resignation than relief. "But not all men seek the same forgiveness, do they?" Bronn almost laughed aloud. The High Sparrow rose, turning to regard him with that measured gaze. The gathered penitents parted like drifting fog, uncertain but obedient. They must have known that if the High Sparrow wished to speak privately, they should vanish. And vanish they did, leaving Bronn and the High Sparrow amid the charred wreckage. "A man like me doesn't bow easily to the notion of sin," Bronn said at last. "Unless there's a good reason or a better price." The High Sparrow showed no change of expression, but Bronn could sense the careful scrutiny behind those gray eyes. "You have knowledge we need," the holy man said. "You've walked the darkest alleys, bartered with cutthroats, made alliances with the city's worst. These sinners hide from the light, and they spread their rot throughout the city. And you want them gone?" Bronn tilted his head, more intrigued than annoyed. "The gold cloaks are incompetent, or else they're in someone's pocket. Your faith militant might be zealous, but they're not subtle. If you plan a purge, you'll find half the city in your dungeons before too long. Perhaps, but many of those souls might yet be saved if we know where they hide. I need to know who runs the smuggling rings, the brothels, the extortion rackets. I need to know who buys contraband from the unsullied pirates off the coast, who trades in secrets to undermine the faith of the people. I need more than the surface. I need the labyrinth beneath the city." Bronn found his lips curling into a humorless grin. "And what do I gain from handing over that knowledge? Gold? A place in your righteous cause? Or do you simply promise not to have me flogged if I confess my own share of sins?" The High Sparrow did not flinch at the cynicism. "I promise that with your help, the new king's landing may find purity, and in that new city you might rise as a man free of his past. Is that worth nothing?" "Funny," Bronn replied. "Freedom from the past seems to come at a high price, and I've known men who claimed purity. Most of them just wanted to wrap their fists in a righteous flag and crush those beneath them. Maybe you're no different. That was the test." Bronn watched closely, seeking a crack in the High Sparrow's serene mask. But all he saw was quiet conviction. The man clasped his hands. "I serve the 7. We are all slaves to something, Ser Bronn. Some to gold, some to power, some to faith, some to fear. Tell me, what do you serve? Bronn did not answer. He let out a low breath, scanning the gloom of the half-burned building. The smell of soot filled his nostrils, mingled with a faint reek of stale sweat and unwashed bodies. He thought about the times he'd crawled through these streets as a nobody. He recalled the shining illusions of nobility he'd come so close to seizing, only to find that illusions vanish at the faintest gust of truth. If the High Sparrow was offering anything, it was a chance to remain on the winning side. With the Queen confined and the city's leadership in flux, the faith was rising in unprecedented ways. Bronn did not relish the idea of being singled out as an obstacle to that rise. "Give me a day or two," Bronn finally said, his voice low. "I'll see what I can do. No promises." The High Sparrow inclined his head. "We shall pray for clarity to guide you." Then, as Bronn turned to leave, the old man's voice drifted after him. "Do not tarry too long in the darkness." Word spread quietly that Bronn was making inquiries. King's Landing thrummed with rumor at all hours. Who was rising, who was falling, who had abandoned which faction. Some said that the Tyrells were on the verge of forging new alliances. Others claimed that the Lannisters were fracturing from within. The Targaryen girl across the sea had gone quiet. Some believed her armies were in disarray. Others believed she was merely waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the loudest whispers, at least among the common folk, concerned the growth of the faith militant and the High Sparrow's unstoppable crusade against immorality. More and more, men and women found themselves locked in cells on suspicion of moral wrongdoing. Among them were less savory criminals and petty thieves, but also perfectly ordinary folk who had merely stepped out of line. Fear was thick in the air. The city had always been dangerous, but the nature of that danger had shifted. Instead of gold cloaks brandishing steel in the name of the crown, there were now star-emblazoned zealots brandishing cudgels in the name of the Seven. Bronn found himself at a makeshift bar in Flea Bottom, where the stench of rotten fish mingled with the acrid fumes of the tanning district. Stools lined a rickety counter made of old crates. The barkeep, a haggard woman with only 3 teeth left, poured cloudy ale that tasted of horse urine and regret. Bronn drank it anyway. He'd had worse, or so he told himself. He kept a watchful eye on the patrons, noticing which pockets were stuffed with coin, which men carried hidden blades. For all the talk of purging sin, Flea Bottom was as it ever was, restless, hungry, filled with the desperate and the scheming. He spotted a familiar face in the corner, a wiry fellow known to many as Crisp the Rat. Crisp's name derived from his scrawny form and the squeaking tone of his voice. He peddled contraband from dusk till dawn. Wines from Dorne, stolen from the shipping crates at the docks. Forged documents that let deserters pass themselves off as free men. Even small vials of poisons if one had the coin. It was rumored Crisp might have ties to Qyburn's informants, or to any of the other shadowy powers that lurked behind King's Landing's parapets. The faith militant would have Crisp strung up in a heartbeat if they could catch him in the act. But Crisp, like many, was quick and elusive. Men of his kind thrived in the city's labyrinth, weaving through hidden passages like ghosts. Bronn approached him without ceremony. Crisp eyed him, recognized him, and offered a thin, crooked grin. "Ser Bronn, haven't seen you in a while. Thought you'd be perched in some castle by now, counting coins and betting ladies." "Maybe I grew bored," Bronn drawled. "How's business?" "Depends on the day," Crisp said, glancing around. "A few months ago, I couldn't keep my wares on the shelf. Now, half the buyers I had are rotting in cells, courtesy of the faith militant. The other half are paranoid they'll be next. Not good for honest scoundrels like me." He gave a short, bitter chuckle. "Got a question for you," Bronn said, leaning closer. "Heard rumors the faith has seized certain black market routes, the ones that run beneath the city. They're turning them into hidden prisons or something of that nature." Crisp's eyes flickered with caution. "I heard those rumors too. Heard they've even posted devout watchers down there. People are going missing in the catacombs. Not sure if it's faith militant rounding them up or if it's some other force using the faith as cover. But it's happened enough that folks have started calling those tunnels the Nether Labyrinth. Nobody wants to go near them anymore, except maybe if they've got a real death wish or if they're desperate. Bronn kept his expression neutral. It was just the sort of tidbit the High Sparrow might be leveraging. Catacombs turned into interrogation chambers, a place away from prying eyes where faith could break a person. But was that truly the High Sparrow's doing? Or was someone else using his name to sow fear? The man certainly had the manpower, fanatics who'd do anything in the name of the Seven. Any sign it's connected to the High Sparrow directly? Crisp shrugged. Hard to say. He's the face of it, but you never can tell who's whispering in the background. You think the High Sparrow's all pious talk, but I've learned that men with strong convictions can be more dangerous than any cell's word. Bronn nodded and tossed a small coin onto the splintered tabletop. Crisp snatched it and pocketed it with practiced speed. You hear anything else about those Nether Labyrinths? Bronn asked. You come find me. I will, Crisp said, though I may start charging more for my secrets. Coins worth less these days, what with all the chaos. Bronn offered a half-smile as if to say, what else is new? Then he turned and made his way out of the bar, ignoring the curious stares of half-drunken patrons. Outside, the sun was gone, replaced by the velvety darkness of a moonless night. The scattered torches and candles of Flea Bottom transformed the streets into a place of dancing shadows. Bronn inhaled the reek of this labyrinth that he'd once known so intimately. Already, he felt the old instincts returning, the sense that everything could be turned to advantage if one knew where to look. He recalled the High Sparrow's request to root out criminal networks. But if Crisp's intelligence was correct, it seemed the Faith had already begun a campaign underground. So why did the High Sparrow need him? Bronn's knowledge of hidden routes could be helpful, but the Faith was hardly lacking in zealots who might glean that same knowledge through intimidation. The missing piece of the puzzle whispered in the back of Bronn's mind. Perhaps the High Sparrow needed more than mere directions. Perhaps he needed someone who could wade into that darkness without fear, someone who could glean truths from criminals who'd rather die than betray their secrets. Bronn wasn't squeamish about those methods. He also wasn't entirely opposed to using them for his own ends. After all, the labyrinth had many secrets that might prove valuable, should a new power wish to take control. In the following days, Bronn spent his hours drifting from one corner of the city to another. He visited old haunts, the worn dockside wharf where sea-soaked crates bobbed precariously, the cramped cellar gambling dens where fortunes rose and collapsed like the tide, the smoke-filled back rooms of unlicensed taverns where sellswords could still be hired for a discreet job. The transformation he witnessed was unsettling. Word of the Faith's crackdown had spread, and many of these old haunts had turned quiet, stifled. A few patrons eyed him with fear, thinking he might be a spy for the zealots. Others begged for any rumor of mercy. Every path he took led him deeper into a sense that King's Landing was on the verge of something cataclysmic. The High Sparrow's net was tightening. And more than once, Bronn felt the curious stares of the Faith militants' outriders, barefoot men in rough-spun robes, some armed with cudgels and a fanatical gleam in their eyes. Yet, in the midst of that tension, deals still flickered in the shadows. One night, Bronn found himself drawn to a decrepit chapel that had been abandoned by the original priests of the Seven. Thieves had turned it into a hidden marketplace under the very nose of the new Faith-dominated city. Flickering torches revealed worn pews now laden with stolen goods. Silver goblets, filigreed bracelets, shimmering pearls from the summer aisles. Bronn recognized some of these trinkets from the coffers of noble houses whose fortunes had plummeted. A tall man with a scar across his right cheek oversaw the market. He scowled when Bronn approached. "If you're here on behalf of the Faith, you can bugger off," the scarred man growled, hand drifting to the hilt of his dagger. Bronn raised his hands in a disarming gesture. "Relax. I'm not here to round anyone up. I'm just curious about what's happening beneath our feet." Suspicion lingered in the man's narrow eyes. Not much left to trade since those robed lunatics started seizing contraband. People are nervous. They're burying their coin or fleeing. Most of the real bosses have gone to ground. Gone to ground? Literally? Or have they left the city? The man shrugged, glancing around, making sure no one was eavesdropping. There's talk of catacombs, deeper than the usual sewers. Some of the major players in the black market are meeting down there now. They say it's safer, less chance of the faith militant busting in with their cudgels and pious screeching. He snorted. But I heard more than a few who've gone down there never come back. Some say there are passageways that lead all the way to the Red Keep. Others say they're illusions, or illusions guarded by more cunning men than the faith. If you want to risk your neck, be my guest. That's me, Bronn said, letting a note of sarcasm color his voice. Reckless, but thanks for the tip. He left the chapel with a weight in his chest. The notion of an even deeper labyrinth beneath the city stoked his curiosity. The Targaryens had built hidden paths, ageways in the Red Keep centuries past, or so the tales claimed. The Targaryen crypts, the tunnels running beneath the Dragon Pit, the old silver mines that had collapsed before the city was fully built. All these rumors meshed in the city's tapestry. Bronn had thought he knew nearly every route worth knowing. But the hush that surrounded these new catacombs was unlike anything he'd encountered. Everyone who spoke of them did so with a mixture of fear and awe. Even Crisp the rat, normally a font of cunning, was reticent. That made it all the more intriguing, and all the more dangerous. Meanwhile, the High Sparrow's subtle pressure mounted. Word came through a runner, a young boy in rags who slipped Bronn a parchment. Scrawled on the parchment was a single line: "Your city needs you." There was no signature, no official seal, but Bronn recognized the style of the High Sparrow's entreaties. He crumpled the note in his fist. The man was reminding him that time was short, that he either cooperated or risked being labeled a heretic in the New Order. The situation was precarious. Bronn found himself walking a tightrope between the city's underworld, which he had known and exploited for years, and the rising power of the faith, which threatened to swallow him if he didn't prove useful. Still, the deeper question gnawed at him. Was he truly about to serve the High Sparrow, or was he exploiting the pious man's designs for his own ends? Because if Bronn was honest with himself, the idea of unveiling the labyrinth for the faith was less appealing than discovering how he might leverage that labyrinth for himself. If there was a hidden meeting place of criminals, then there was a chance to corner some unknown advantage. Maybe blackmail, maybe a trove of stolen gold, or perhaps a route to the heart of the Red Keep that no one else knew. Knowledge was power, more valuable than any sword. Yet, if he withheld that knowledge from the High Sparrow, he would become a target. If he gave that knowledge away, he might forfeit a golden opportunity. The question churned in his mind, day and night. At last, he decided it was time to see for himself. Under cover of darkness, Bronn made his way to a discreet entrance near the city's easternmost walls, close to the long-abandoned warehouse district. Legends told of an extensive drainage network built when the city was expanding. He found the rusted iron grate he remembered from a job decades past. It was a tight fit, but after some prying, he was able to slip through. The stench was immediate, a pungent mix of stagnant water, rotting debris, and the faint tang of algae. Torchlight revealed trickling rivulets of water. Rats scurried, startled by the intruder. Bronn crept forward, mindful of the slick stone floor. He tested each step carefully, recalling an old map he'd once glimpsed. The main sewer lines would open up into larger tunnels that soared high enough for a man to walk upright. In some of those tunnels, collapsed sections gave way to older structures, perhaps even the fabled catacombs. If Crisp and the others were right, the criminals in hiding had discovered these paths. Bronn intended to find them. At the first major intersection, he paused and listened. A faint sound, like distant voices, drifted through the darkness. There, he noticed a crude symbol scrawled on the wall, a circle with a jagged line through it, the sign of a local smuggling band he'd once done business with. He followed that sign deeper, turning at intersections where the watery echoes guided him. The gloom was claustrophobic. More than once, he paused to ensure no watchers lurked behind him. Twice, he caught glimpses of robed figures. Men of the faith militant, perhaps? They prowled with small lanterns, muttering prayers under their breath. Bronn had to sidestep into hidden alcoves to avoid them. The tension in his gut told him that if they discovered him here, the encounter would turn violent. The last thing Bronn wanted was to face a fanatic in a narrow tunnel. They'd happily die to uphold their cause, while Bronn had no interest in dying at all. He pressed on until he found what he sought, a section of the tunnel where crude steps descended even further below street level. The stonework here was older, pitted by centuries of flood and neglect. Runnels of scummy water trickled along the edges, but the central walkway was dry. Bronn crouched, letting his torchlight dance across the walls. Ancient carvings, half eroded, hinted at some lost architecture. He recognized no gods or sigils among the worn images. The labyrinth had older secrets, it seemed, predating the faith's presence. The air here felt colder. A prickle ran across his neck. Raising the torch higher, he glimpsed a series of arches branching off the main corridor. He paused, sniffing. A different odor reached him. Not sewage, but a whiff of burnt wax and perhaps roasted meat. That meant people. Quietly, he advanced. Flickers of candlelight shone from beneath one of the archways. There, he heard subdued voices in conversation, though he could not make out the words. Carefully, he doused his torch in the water and inched closer, letting the faint glow from the archway guide him. He pressed his back against the wall, peering around the corner. A small gathering was in progress, a clandestine circle of figures huddled around a cluster of lanterns. He recognized one face, a minor crime lord named Farlan the Butcher, known for extortion and smuggling. Beside Farlan stood a hooded shape, and another man wearing a tattered tabard that bore a sigil, half scratched away. The conversation was hushed. Too dangerous up there. The faith's everywhere, someone said. Another voice, deeper, replied, "We can't just stay hidden forever. We're losing coin by the day. The supply lines." Then Farlan cut them off. "Shut your yapping. We'll wait for the rest to arrive." "We got word from one of them devout watchers. They say the High Sparrow's planning a purge soon, a bigger one. He's just waiting to gather enough muscle to storm the dens in Flea Bottom and the harbor warehouses." Bronn's eyes narrowed. So the criminals had their own informants among the faith. That meant the High Sparrow's net wasn't as cohesive as it appeared. A double game was being played. The idea that the faith militant might be in league with smugglers, or at least some corrupt branch of them, was not surprising. Piety could easily mask greed. A different man, whose voice carried a sneer, said, "We can't trust that devout watcher. He's probably just feeding us half-truths. For all we know, the High Sparrows sniffed out this hideout." An uneasy tension gripped the circle. Bronn held his breath, muscles tensed, ready to retreat if needed. But the criminals seemed locked in their own discourse. Finally, Farlan said, "The labyrinth is ours as long as we control the entrances. And we do. If the faith tries to push down here, we'll ambush them. We'll cut them off at the choke points. But we need manpower, so I want each of you to send word to your foot soldiers. Gear up, gather in the old storage caverns. Any man who can wield a sword or spear, we want them. I don't care if they're cutthroats or brutes. We'll hold these tunnels, and we'll make the city above pay tribute for safe passage." That elicited murmurs of reluctant agreement. Bronn felt a sardonic twist in his gut. So these criminals planned to carve out their own kingdom beneath the city, while the faith reigned above. The notion was almost humorous if it weren't so deadly. A silent war was brewing. The High Sparrow presumably wished to root out this underworld entirely, while the underworld was plotting to entrench itself deeper, literally, in these catacombs. And here Bronn stood on the cusp of either side. He quietly withdrew before they could spot him. As he retraced his steps, he mulled over the implications. The criminals were preparing to fight, and the faith, from all appearances, was preparing to crush them. The question was, how best to use this knowledge? If he provided the High Sparrow with the details of where and how these criminals planned to fortify themselves, the faith might succeed in a swift purge of the labyrinth. Bronn would earn favor, maybe get rewarded with some measure of security in the new regime. But he'd also be complicit in turning over men with whom he'd once done business. Not that loyalty mattered much to Bronn. but burning bridges was dangerous. Alternatively, he could warn the criminals that the High Sparrow sought deeper infiltration, set them at an advantage, and they might pay handsomely if they could hold the labyrinth against the Faith's zealots. Yet if they lost, and the Faith discovered Bronn's betrayal, there would be no redemption, no safety from the Faith's wrath. That was the gamble. He had to weigh the odds. The next day, Bronn emerged into the city of the Poor Fellows, near the Great September. He observed lines of ragged faithful awaiting their chance to pray or confess. The Faith militant, armed with cudgels and clad in humble garments, patrolled the courtyard. Their eyes swept the crowds for any sign of indecency or crime. Overhead, the bells told a solemn tune, echoing across the city's sprawl. There, Bronn found a small door near the rear of the September. A discreet knock eventually brought forth a wiry devotee, who led him down corridors into a plain chamber lit only by a single window of stained glass. The High Sparrow sat at a simple wooden table, hands clasped. He did not rise when Bronn entered, merely fixed him with a calm stare. A cup of water rested before him, no wine, no extravagances, just water. Nearby stood two other sparrows, silent, watchful. The tension in the room was palpable. Bronn inclined his head in greeting. "Heard you wanted a chat." "Indeed," the High Sparrow answered. His voice was not unkind, but it carried steel beneath the softness. "We have waited on your decision. Are you prepared to help the Faith cleanse King's Landing of its corruption?" Bronn exhaled slowly. He weighed his words. "I've learned a few things. The criminals in the city are gathering underground. They found new routes, catacombs that run deeper than your typical sewer. They're organizing to defend those tunnels. If you send your men storming in blindly, you'll lose a lot of them." A flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, flitted across the High Sparrow's features. "Then your knowledge is indeed valuable. Can you guide us to their strongholds?" "That depends." Bronn glanced at the two silent sparrows. He recognized them as close disciples, zealots who do anything for their spiritual leader. "I'm not offering my services for free, nor do I expect coin. But if I help you, I want protection from the Faith. I want a promise that I won't be tried for whatever sins you might hold over me. We do not offer absolution so lightly. Confessions must be made, and penance must be served." The High Sparrow spoke carefully. "But if you truly help us, if you show your willingness to atone, you will find the Faith can be merciful." Bronn studied the older man's face. There was a sincerity there, but also an edge. If Bronn stepped out of line, these devout watchers would hound him to the ends of the earth. "Fine," Bronn said at last. "But if I guide you, I do it on my terms. Send me men who'll follow my lead. We go in small numbers first to figure out the layout, take out the ringleaders quietly. If you charge in with an army, you'll spark a bloodbath. The criminals are ready for that." The High Sparrow considered this. "We prefer not to spill unnecessary blood. We wish to bring them to the light, if possible." Bronn rolled his eyes. "You won't be bringing these men to any light. They're cornered beasts. They'll fight. The best you can hope for is to catch them off guard. I'll do what I can to minimize the slaughter. But don't expect them to come up here, kneel, and beg forgiveness." The High Sparrow accepted this with a nod. "The seven teach us that some men's hearts are hardened beyond redemption. We shall pray they see the error of their ways, but we will not shrink from purging evil for the greater good." And there it was, the unyielding side of faith. Bronn had seen many men hide behind armor, but the High Sparrow wielded conviction like armor. In his mind, he was in the right no matter the cost. Bronn suppressed a twinge of unease. "When do we start?" "Soon," the High Sparrow said. He turned to one of his silent disciples. "Gather a half-dozen of our most devoted. Tell them to ready themselves for a descent into darkness." Then he returned his gaze to Bronn. "Thank you, Sir Bronn. You shall have your chance at redemption." Bronn nodded, trying not to show the tangle of emotions in his gut. Perhaps the High Sparrow thought he was reeling him into a righteous cause. But Bronn had not abandoned his own cunning. He was not about to wade into that labyrinth without a plan. He had no intention of dying for the High Sparrow, nor did he intend to become an enemy of every criminal in King's Landing. If he played this right, he could glean the labyrinth's secrets, let the High Sparrow claim a partial victory, and vanish with a small fortune or leverage that might come from capturing certain ringleaders. Or, at the very least, he could keep his head attached to his shoulders a while longer. 2 nights later, Bronn stood at the threshold of the same drainage entrance he had used before. He wore no shining armor, just dark leathers and a cloak that blended with the night. Around him stood a handful of the Faith Militant, each carrying a cudgel and a knife, their bare feet silent on the damp earth. They were hardened zealots, their expressions grim and resolute. They looked to Bronn with a hint of suspicion, as though uncertain if trusting a cell's word was wise. But they had their orders from the High Sparrow himself. Bronn gave them a curt gesture. "Keep your torches low. We don't want to announce ourselves." Slowly, they slipped into the gloom, one by one. The reek of the tunnel enveloped them. The Faith Militant exchanged quiet prayers. Bronn led them deeper, retracing the path to the intersection. There, he paused, listening for patrols. His keen instincts told him something was off. The watery echoes were too still. Earlier, he'd encountered robed watchers in these tunnels. Tonight, the hush felt menacing. He signaled for them to wait and crept ahead, pressing himself against a slick wall. His eyes strained against the gloom. He heard something, a muffled cry, quickly silenced. Then a soft scuffle of boots on stone. The criminals must have their own scouts patrolling. A group of watchers approached from the east corridor, their lantern bobbing faintly. Bronn weighed his options. If they encountered each other head-on, a fight would break out. The Faith Zealots behind him were itching for a holy confrontation, but Bronn preferred to maintain the element of surprise. He motioned for the Zealots to douse their light. They complied, and darkness enveloped them. The criminals' lantern light grew brighter, illuminating the intersection. Bronn pressed into the shadows. The criminals, 3 of them, passed by, apparently not noticing the hidden intruders. Their footsteps echoed for a while, then faded. Bronn exhaled softly. He could sense the tension in the men behind him. They wanted to strike, but he knew better. "Not yet," he whispered. "We'll press on." Farther along, they descended the stairs to the older catacombs. This time, the hush was absolute. No flicker of lamplight, no sign of watchers. Bronn wondered if the criminals had relocated their gathering deeper still. With careful steps, he led the Faith Militant around a bend. The corridor opened into a wide chamber with a vaulted ceiling. Pillars, black with mildew, reached up to the darkness. Shards of broken stone and debris littered the floor. Bronn stepped over a loose chunk. Something skittered across the floor, making a sharp clatter. A voice barked from somewhere in the darkness. "Who goes there?" A moment later, a flare of torchlight revealed 3 armed men behind a makeshift barricade of crates and rubble. Bronn cursed under his breath as the men raised crossbows. One of them recognized him, perhaps from the silhouette or the sound of his voice. "Bronn." He hesitated. The Faith Militant behind him bristled, ready to surge forward, but a crossbow bolt could skewer them easily from that vantage. Thinking fast, Bronn shouted back, "Hold your fire. I'm alone." He gestured for the zealots to stay hidden. A crossbowman stepped around the barricade, holding the torch higher. When he saw Bronn's face, he let out a short laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't expect to see you down here. You lost your nerve up top." Bronn forced a chuckle. "I heard there was a meeting, thought I'd see if there's coin to be made. But you lot seem mighty jumpy." "As well we should be," the crossbowman said. "Never know who might come crawling down here to stick a blade in our backs for the High Sparrow. That old bastard's turned half the city into informants." Bronn kept his posture casual, a hand near his sword hilt. "I'm no friend of the faith. I'm just hungry for a chance. Same as you." The crossbowman eyed him warily. "We'll see. For now, you can wait here while we fetch Farlin. Don't move." With that, he barked an order to the others, and one man ran off deeper into the catacombs. The crossbow stayed leveled at Bronn. Meanwhile, In the gloom behind Bronn, the faith zealots pressed themselves against the corridor walls, unseen. They'd heard the exchange. Adrenaline ran hot in Bronn's veins. He'd entered the lion's den. He could signal the zealots to charge now, but that crossbow bolt might find its mark in his back. Or a dozen criminals might pour into this chamber in a matter of seconds. He needed a more advantageous moment. It took only a minute before the returning footsteps echoed. Farlan appeared, flanked by two tough-looking brutes. Farlan's face twisted in suspicion when he saw Bronn. "Didn't expect you here," he growled. "Last I heard, you were sniffing around the surface, making deals with who knows who. You get tired of your fancy friends." Bronn shrugged. "Fancy friends come and go. I stick with whoever offers me a good proposition. Word is you're setting up your own fortress down here. And if we are? Sounds like something that could be profitable if done right," Bronn said, keeping his tone light. "But the faith's prowling. If they catch wind of this, they'll send their zealots in. You'll need someone who knows how they think." Farlan narrowed his eyes. "You offering your services?" Bronn gave a slight nod. "For a price. I can feed you information. There are certain arrangements I've made with the faith. I can keep them off your back long enough for you to entrench yourselves." Farlan exchanged a look with his men. "And what's to stop you from leading them straight to us?" he demanded. Bronn let out a short laugh. "If I wanted to lead them here, I'd have come with a small army. Think about it. I wouldn't just stroll in alone. As for trust, well, trust is a big word. But you know me. I've got no reason to see you all thrown in a cell, so long as there's something in it for me." A flicker of understanding passed over Farlan's features. He gestured to his men, and they lowered their crossbows slightly, though not entirely. "You've got guts walking in here like this. Fine, we'll talk. Let's go somewhere less exposed." He jerked his chin at a side passage. Bronn tensed but nodded. He'd have to find some way to signal the zealots, or else everything could go south in an instant. He moved toward the side passage with Farlan's brutes trailing behind. As soon as he stepped beyond the barricade, he risked a quick glance over his shoulder into the darkness. The faith men were well trained enough not to reveal themselves, but Bronn knew they were there, waiting. He continued on, following Farlan through a cramped corridor that led to a small chamber, a natural cavern with a dripping stalactite overhead. Flickering lanterns cast wavering shadows on the walls. A crude table sat at the center, strewn with maps and scraps of parchment. Several wooden crates formed makeshift seats. Farlan sat, motioning for Bronn to do the same. The brutes loomed nearby, arms folded. One of them carried a large warhammer, the other a curved dagger. Bronn felt the tension thick in the air. Farlan cleared his throat. "So, you say you can keep the faith off our backs. How exactly?" Bronn leaned back slightly, as though relaxed. "They're under the impression that I'm providing them intel on how to find you. That's true, but the intel can be shaped. If I mislead them about your real hideouts, if I say you're holed up in a different tunnel, they'll go chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, you'll have time to fortify." Farlan studied him with a calculating stare. "You expect me to believe you're not just feeding them every detail right now? If I were, do you think I'd show my face here? That would be foolish. Look, I'm offering an arrangement. You fill my purse, and I'll keep the faith chasing their own tails. Once they're exhausted and their followers lose faith in them, we can carve out our own piece of the city." Farlan's eyes flicked to one of the parchments on the table. It looked like a rough map of the catacombs, marked with various colored lines. "We have a plan. The labyrinth goes deeper than any of them suspect. If the faith tries to come down, we'll drown them in these tunnels, seal off certain passages. The city above will see the corpses of their so-called protectors. Fear will shift. The High Sparrow might be forced to negotiate. Then we name our price. The lords want trade to keep flowing. They'll pay for safe passage once we control the catacombs." Bronn nodded thoughtfully. "Ambitious, but feasible. Indeed, we have men loyal to the cause. Men who've lost everything at the hands of the nobility or the faith." Farlan smirked bitterly. "A man with nothing left can be a very dangerous thing. Bronn kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. This was bigger than he realized. A coordinated rebellion forming beneath the city, with a plan to hold King's Landing ransom by choking trade routes. Now he understood the High Sparrow's sense of urgency. This wasn't just about a few petty thieves. It was an uprising. Bronn could see how it might tear the city apart. Ships would come to port, find no safe path to bring goods into the city, or face extortion from these labyrinth keepers. Meanwhile, the Faith would ramp up violence, the gold cloaks might intervene, and chaos would spiral. "You'll need to be certain you can handle the backlash," Bronn said. "The Crown might send an army to root you out." Farlan gave a humorless laugh. "The Crown is weakened. Tommen is but a boy. The Lannisters are in disarray. The Tyrells might have gold, but if Mace Tyrell tries to mobilize, he'll be dancing to the Faith's tune. No, we're well positioned. The biggest threat is the High Sparrow's zealots, and there'll be no match for us in these tunnels." Bronn considered his next move. If he pretended to ally with Farlan here, he could glean enough details to feed the High Sparrow a decisive victory. Or, if he wanted to switch sides entirely, he could help Farlan sabotage the Faith. But which side was truly safer? Neither was guaranteed. He ran a hand through his hair. "What do you need from me?" "Then, if you've got it all figured out, we need to know exactly when the Faith plans to attack, how many men, where. If you can feed us that intel, we'll be ready. We'll butcher them to the last man, and that will send a message." A flicker of distaste passed through Bronn. He never minded a fight, but slaughtering men who believed they were doing good might earn him a horde of vengeful zealots. Still, he kept his face impassive. "And in return? A generous cut of the profits from the labyrinth's tolls. Enough to keep you in comforts for the rest of your life, or buy yourself a small keep somewhere far from here. Once the city falls under our thumb, you'll reap the rewards. We could even make you a sort of liaison. After all, you'll have valuable connections up top, and we'll have the might down below." Bronn let the words hang in the stale air. A life of comfort had always been his aim, and a small keep sounded tempting. But he also knew the criminal's word was worth as much as a donkey's bray if things turned sour. If they faced a stiff defeat, they might turn on him in a heartbeat. He forced a wry grin. "That's quite the offer." Farlan shrugged. "We've done business before, Bronn. I know your type. You don't care for the fancy titles. You care for results. We can give you results, if you're truly on our side." Bronn started to reply, but a faint shuffling of feet in the corridor alerted him. He tensed. Had the Faith zealots grown impatient? Were they about to storm in? Any sudden movement could blow his cover. Farlan noticed his sudden stillness and narrowed his eyes. Something wrong. Before Bronn could reply, a shout came from beyond the chamber entrance. The brutes by Farlan's side jerked their heads around. One of them moved to investigate. The tension snapped like a drawn bowstring. Bronn realized the Faith men must have followed him. Now they were discovered. He had to decide swiftly. Would he keep his pretenses with Farlan, or declare his hand in front of him? The brute stuck his head out of the chamber, only to gasp. The sound of a cudgel meeting flesh echoed off the walls. The man stumbled back into view, eyes wide with shock, blood trickling from his scalp. Farlan scrambled to his feet, drawing a short sword. "What in the—" he growled. Into the flickering lamplight stepped two Faith zealots, their eyes blazing with righteous fury. Behind them, others pressed in. Weapons raised, they advanced. One of Farlan's men tried to fire a crossbow bolt, but the shot went wide. Another zealot lunged, striking with surprising speed. A chaotic brawl erupted, a swirl of torchlight and shrieks echoing in the small cavern. Bronn ducked to avoid a stray blow. For a moment, he considered turning on the zealots to maintain the ruse, but that seemed a fool's errand. There were too many zealots, and they had the fervor of those who believed themselves unstoppable. Instead, Bronn seized an opening and stepped behind the Faith men. He saw Farlan struggling against two zealots, one brandishing a cudgel, the other trying to wrestle the short sword from Farlan's grip. The brutes moved to protect their boss, but they were outnumbered. Despite Farlan's savage swings, A zealot managed to knock him down with a vicious blow to the side. Blood spattered the damp stones. Bronn stayed back, letting the faith do their work. The entire skirmish took less than a minute. When it was over, Farlan and his men lay sprawled in a heap of groans. One or two might still be alive, but they were done for. The zealots, breathing heavily, turned to Bronn with a mix of suspicion and triumph. "What happened to waiting?" Bronn snapped at them, feigning anger. "I almost got a crossbow bolt in my spine." The lead zealot, a gaunt young man with sunken cheeks, gave a fervent smile. "Forgive us, Ser Bronn. We heard them speaking of murder, of defying the Seven. We couldn't allow them to remain unpunished. Our faith demanded action." Bronn suppressed a snarl. These zealots nearly cost him his head. But they had done him a favor by dealing with Farlan for him, a situation that might have become complicated. He glanced at Farlan, who bled on the floor. His eyes flicked up, meeting Bronn's gaze. There was betrayal and rage in them. Bronn offered a faint shrug, as if to say, "You were too slow." Then one of the zealots stomped hard on Farlan's wrist, forcing him to relinquish his weapon. Another blow to the head silenced him, possibly for good. A hush settled over the cavern. One of the zealots lit a fresh torch and surveyed the casualties. "We should search their bodies, see if they carry any heretical items or documents." Bronn took a step forward, kneeling beside Farlan's corpse. He rifled through the man's pockets, finding a small pouch of coins and a folded parchment. He palmed the coins while the zealots were busy searching the others. The parchment turned out to be a partial map of the catacombs, lines crisscrossing beneath various wards of the city. Bronn tucked it inside his shirt. He figured that knowledge might be valuable. The zealots, meanwhile, uncovered a few more parchments, some scribbled notes about supply routes, and a small chest containing stolen jewels. They exulted as though they'd just captured the city's greatest treasure. A wave of exhaustion hit Bronn. This was only one nest of criminals. There would be many more, and the deeper question of how to exploit this labyrinth for personal gain still beckoned. For the moment, though, the High Sparrow would be pleased. They'd struck a blow against the underworld. The question Bronn asked himself: was he truly serving the High Sparrow's cause, or was he setting the stage for something else? They made their way out of the catacombs with as many prisoners as were still alive, dragging them in chains. The zealots praised the Seven for guiding their mission, for delivering them triumph. Bronn kept quiet. He couldn't shake the image of Farlan's accusing stare. In another world, he might have joined the criminals below. But in this one, it seemed the High Sparrow and his faith were ascendant. For now, Bronn would sail with the prevailing wind. A frenzy of rumor erupted the following day. Word spread that an entire criminal cell had been wiped out in the catacombs by the faith militant, guided by an unnamed informant. That informant, of course, was Bronn, though his identity was not public knowledge. Some criminals, those who survived or heard the story, whispered that Bronn was a traitor who sold out his own. Others whispered that he'd played both sides. Some swore to kill him if they ever got the chance. But as of yet, no one could confirm the story. Meanwhile, the High Sparrow was said to be quietly elated, for the faith had struck a decisive blow. Bronn met the High Sparrow in a secluded courtyard behind the Great September. A thin drizzle fell from the gray sky, soaking the worn stones. Despite the dampness, the High Sparrow seemed unaffected. He stood calmly, letting the rain drip from his sparse hair. "I hear you have done your duty well," the old man said as Bronn approached. "The labyrinth is home to many such dens of vice, but your guidance allowed us to remove one of the largest. This is a good beginning." Bronn gave a slight shrug. "Not sure about good. Plenty of blood spilled down there. Sometimes the path to purity is bathed in sacrifice," the High Sparrow said, clasping his hands. "But we have freed the city of that vermin. For that we are grateful. Perhaps you have earned a portion of redemption." His gaze flicked to Bronn. "I sense your doubt, Ser Bronn. Know that the Seven watch, and they know your heart's sincerity. If you truly wish to help, you will continue to show us the way." Bronn thought of the criminals who'd threatened to fortify the catacombs. Perhaps the faith strike would scare them away or force them deeper. Either way, the underworld was not yet defeated. So what now? You want me to keep hunting these nests? The High Sparrow nodded gravely. Yes, and each time we shall bring them to justice. We will cleanse the labyrinth until it can no longer breed sin. Bronn suppressed a sigh. You want to cleanse King's Landing from top to bottom. That's ambitious. The people deserve a city free from fear, the High Sparrow replied. We must do the work, no matter how arduous. Then he gave Bronn a long, measured look. You hesitate. Why? Bronn's lips twitched. He wasn't used to men prying into his conscience. But he also knew the High Sparrow was cunning. I'm just wondering what happens when we've cleared out the criminals. Will the city truly be any better off, or just replaced with a new kind of fear? A faint, sad smile curved the High Sparrow's mouth. You are wise to ask such questions. Fear can be a tool of the devout. But remember, fear of the Seven's judgment is different from fear of a knife in the dark. We do not seek to enslave these people. We seek to guide them to moral living. If that guidance must come at the point of a cudgel for now, so be it. In time, faith will transform them. Bronn glanced at the gloom of the courtyard. He knew King's Landing too well. If it wasn't criminals terrorizing the streets, it was the crown or the faith. The city thrived on conflict. All right, he said gruffly. I'll do my part. But I want your assurance that if the city ever decides to turn on me, you'll stand in my defense. I'm not about to hand you half the city's secrets only to be flayed by some lord who doesn't like that I help topple his profitable black markets. The High Sparrow nodded, placing a hand on Bronn's shoulder. As long as you remain loyal to the cause of the Seven, you will find protection here. One day, perhaps, you shall be free of your past's weight. Maybe. Bronn didn't want to dwell on the thought. He'd never believed in redemption, but he believed in survival, and for the moment, the High Sparrow was his best chance. He offered a curt nod and stepped back, letting the drizzle wash over him. I'll find you when I have more information. Days turned into weeks. With each passing rumor of labyrinth hunts, the city descended deeper into paranoia. The criminals responded in kind. Some fled, seeking the uncertain refuge of the countryside or other free cities. Others dug themselves deeper, forging alliances with unscrupulous gold cloaks or quietly paying off minor sparrows to look the other way. Whispers claimed that some zealots had betrayed the High Sparrow for coin. Bronn suspected it was true, though whether the High Sparrow had knowledge of such betrayals was an open question. The labyrinth itself became a war zone of sporadic skirmishes. The Faith Militant, emboldened by the initial victory, launched raids under Bronn's guidance, though the criminals adapted quickly, setting traps and pitfalls. Lives were lost on both sides in the gloom. The city above felt the tremors of conflict below. Some nights, the faint clang of steel echoed through the sewer grates. Blood seeped up in the drains. Bronn found himself pacing a precarious line, ever watchful for the day one side or the other might decide to brand him a traitor. In a short time, he'd become indispensable to the High Sparrow. His knowledge led to the capture of 2 more underworld bosses. And yet, Bronn often withheld certain secrets for himself, gleaned from the maps he'd collected or the interrogations he'd witnessed. He told the Faith enough to secure minor triumphs, but not enough to thoroughly wipe out the labyrinth networks in one fell swoop. He was playing for time, or so he told himself, waiting to see which side offered the best long-term gain. Meanwhile, he quietly tracked rumors of hidden treasure caches, stashes of contraband that might be sold for a tidy profit. Some nights, he even ventured alone into the labyrinth, slipping past watchful eyes to mark certain sealed passages. If the day came where he needed to vanish from King's Landing with a fortune, he wanted to be ready. But the High Sparrow was not a fool. He asked pointed questions, pressing Bronn for more detailed leads. The man's conviction made him relentless, and Bronn found it increasingly difficult to maintain a balancing act. On a misty evening, as Bronn walked through the courtyard of the Great September, he was intercepted by one of the High Sparrow's close disciples, a bony woman with a hawkish nose and fiery eyes. She called herself Sister Jocelyn. She beckoned Bronn into a cramped side chapel, where candles flickered on a small altar. "The High Sparrow wishes to speak with you," she said, voice low but urgent. "We have received word of a major gathering in the depths, a union of all the remaining crime lords. If we strike them at once, we could end this plague." Bronn forced a casual stance. "Where and when?" She fixed him with an unwavering stare. "We were hoping you could tell us. Our informants claim the criminals have chosen a new hideout, one so deep even we do not know it. But we suspect you have ways to find out." Bronn silently cursed. It was true that he'd heard of some underworld lords merging forces, forging a final stand. But he hadn't yet gleaned the exact location. Or perhaps he had, but was uncertain. He weighed his response. "I might be able to find out, but I'll need time, and it won't be easy. Those criminals know their networks are compromised." Sister Jocelyn nodded. "We can offer you additional eyes." But the High Sparrow grows impatient. He senses that if we do not act swiftly, the forces of darkness will regroup stronger than ever. The mention of impatience was a clear warning. If Bronn didn't deliver soon, the High Sparrow would question his loyalty. "I understand," he said, swallowing his frustration. "I'll do what I can." That night, Bronn scoured his own hidden notes, cross-referencing rumored gatherings with the labyrinth maps he'd managed to pilfer. One area stood out, a vast cistern beneath the old merchant quarter, rumored to connect to a crypt from the Targaryen days. The criminals might choose such a place to gather, for it was out of reach of the more commonly used sewer tunnels. But confirming that would mean venturing into unknown depths, and potentially walking into a den of desperate men. If he returned with solid intel, the High Sparrow would demand a raid. The criminals would be slaughtered, or at least many of them would. And then perhaps the Labyrinth War would be all but done. Where would that leave Bronn? He nearly laughed at himself. Once upon a time, he would have taken the easiest path to profit. Now, he found himself entangled in a moral and political quagmire. He told himself it was still about survival, but perhaps some measure of conscience had wormed its way into his thoughts. Or maybe it was just caution. King's Landing was never simple. In the quiet gloom of his rented chamber in a dingy inn, he wondered if it would be wiser to slip away altogether, ride for the countryside and leave this madness behind. But he couldn't abandon the potential fortune hidden beneath these streets. Nor could he risk the High Sparrow labeling him a traitor in absentia. The zealots might hunt him to the ends of Westeros. At last, he sighed and made his decision. He would find the location of the gathering, feed the High Sparrow enough information to achieve a victory, and in the chaos, he'd secure whatever spoils he could. Then he'd vanish from the city, leaving the faith and the criminals to bicker over the ashes. It was as good a plan as any. 3 nights later, under a crescent moon, Bronn quietly lowered himself down a rope into a half-submerged tunnel near the merchant quarter. The water was ankle-deep, cold and brackish. He lit a small lantern, careful to cover its flame so the light wouldn't carry far. Sloshing forward, he followed a route gleaned from the labyrinth maps, hoping the water level wouldn't rise with the tide. The tunnel ended at a sunken chamber whose ceiling was lined with dripping stalactites. A faint, flickering light emanated from an archway to the left. Voices echoed in the distance. Bronn inhaled and moved carefully, dousing his lantern. He kept one hand on the hilt of his dagger. The ground sloped upward, leading him out of the water onto a stone platform. Through the archway, he glimpsed a cavernous space lit by scattered torches. A large cistern, indeed, with columns rising from the depths of dark water. Dozens of men had gathered on the central platform, some heavily armed, others dressed like merchants or petty nobles. At a glance, Bronn recognized half a dozen crime lords of varying infamy. Crisp the Rat was there, standing near the edge, looking uneasy. Another was Red Alistair, a portly smuggler known for running contraband from Dragonstone. And at the center stood a tall figure in a hooded cloak, addressing the group in a commanding tone. Bronn realized he'd never seen this particular ringleader before, but from the hush in the chamber, he or she must have been influential. The hooded figure spoke, voice echoing. "We have all lost men to the High Sparrow's zealots. Our gold flows slower. The city is strangled by their pious tyranny. But we are not beaten. If we unite, if we pool our resources, we can strike at the faith's heart. Their seat of power is the September. We can blockade the city from below, cutting off supplies, forcing the crown to either starve or meet our demands. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the throng. Crisp the rat fidgeted. But they'll come for us in force, he said, squeaking with anxiety. If we're pinned in these catacombs, they could smoke us out or flood the tunnels. We must strike first, the hooded leader answered. The faith militant believes they are invincible. We will show them otherwise. We have men who know the weaknesses of the Great September's foundations. We can place fires or collapses in strategic points. We can bring the entire edifice down if necessary. Then the faith's moral stranglehold on the city will shatter. Bronn's blood chilled. They were discussing open war. If they blew up the September or collapsed it, thousands might die, faithful or otherwise. The city might descend into anarchy. A quiet dread settled over him. This was not just about some criminals fighting zealots in back alleys. This was the potential destruction of one of the city's greatest landmarks, a blow that would shake the entire realm. If the High Sparrow even suspected such a plot, he would unleash a merciless purge. And if these criminals succeeded, the city might never recover. Bronn realized that delivering this intelligence to the High Sparrow would seal the criminals' fate. But letting them proceed might spell an even darker fate for the city. As he crouched there, uncertain, Crisp the rat spoke up again. What about Ser Bronn? Last I heard, he was guiding the faith. If he's feeding them information, they could find us here. The hooded figure's head turned slowly, scanning the gathered men. Yes, I've heard of Bronn's role. He's a sellsword, always looking to survive. My understanding is that he can be bought or swayed. But if he proves an obstacle, he will be dealt with. Bronn sighed internally, so they already had him in their crosshairs. He crept backward, deciding he'd learned enough. He needed to get out quietly. One slip of his foot, though, sent a small rock tumbling into the water. The plop echoed alarmingly. Several heads snapped in his direction. Torchlight flared as men shifted. Bronn cursed under his breath, pressing himself flat against the wall. Footsteps splashed toward the archway, and he heard Crisp's sharp voice. Someone's here, over there. Bronn broke into a sprint, ignoring stealth now. He raced back down the corridor, lantern unlit, heart pounding. Shouts and splashes pursued him. In the darkness, he had the advantage. He'd studied these passages. But the criminals knew them too, at least some of them. He heard voices branching off from side tunnels, trying to cut him off. He took a sharp turn, nearly slipped into deeper water, then managed to find the rope he'd used. As he frantically climbed, crossbow bolts clattered off the stone wall. One hissed through the air, missing by inches. Gritting his teeth, he hauled himself up and out, back into the open night. Shouts echoed below. But unless they had ropes prepared, the criminals would be delayed climbing out of that sinkhole. Bronn hurried away into the labyrinth of alleyways above. He panted, mind racing. They planned to collapse the September. That meant the city was a hair's breadth from catastrophe. If the High Sparrow learned of this, he'd respond with total ferocity. Was that better than letting the criminals detonate half of King's Landing? Perhaps so. But delivering this intel might make Bronn the prime target of every underworld figure from here to the Red Keep. He paced in a deserted courtyard, rain starting to fall. The lumps of adrenaline coursed through his veins. At length he cursed again, choosing the lesser evil. The faith, for all their zeal, had never threatened to blow up half the city. He had no love for them, but at least they offered a semblance of order. He would tell the High Sparrow tonight. In the hush before dawn, Bronn found himself once more in the High Sparrow's austere chamber. Flickering candles lit the old man's visage. He listened intently to Bronn's report, his eyes narrowing as the sellsword spoke of the criminal's plan to undermine the Great September. Attention grew in the High Sparrow's posture. When Bronn finished, the room felt colder than before. "This is grave news indeed," the High Sparrow murmured. "They seek to destroy the House of the Seven. This is an abomination that cannot be allowed. We must strike first at once." Bronn nodded. They're gathering in a huge cistern beneath the merchant quarter. I can show you how to get close, but they'll expect a fight. They're well armed. Then we shall muster our might, the High Sparrow said, standing up. He gestured for one of his disciples to prepare the faith militant. We will descend upon them with holy wrath. This time we shall not rely on stealth or small numbers. We shall meet them in force. He turned to Bronn. You will guide us, yes? Bronn grimaced. If there's another way, we have no choice. The city's fate hangs in the balance. If they collapse the September, thousands will die, and the realm's faith will be shaken to its core. The Seven call on you to prevent such evil. Bronn rubbed the back of his neck. Fine, but understand these criminals are cornered. They'll fight to the death. Then so be it, the High Sparrow replied, a fervent light in his eyes. We place our faith in the Seven. Bronn swallowed. The die was cast. He was about to lead a horde of zealots into a final confrontation, deep in the catacombs. He pictured Crisp the Rat's terrified face, the hooded ringleader's commanding presence. If the criminals discovered who led the faith to them, Bronn's name would become the foulest curse on every street. But it was too late to turn back. He had chosen his side. Survival demanded it. Dawn broke with ominous clouds overhead. By mid-morning, a storm battered King's Landing, lightning crackling in the sky. Beneath the hammering rain, hundreds of the faith militant converged near the labyrinth entrances that Bronn had identified. Barefoot men and women, clutching cudgels and makeshift spears, wearing plain robes and the star sigil of the Seven. Some carried torches wrapped in oilcloth. Others chanted prayers, calling upon the Father and the warrior to guide them. The High Sparrow himself stood at the forefront, staff in hand, robes soaked through, but unwavering. Bronn stood to one side, cloaked and hooded, feeling the tension electrify the air. Are you ready? The High Sparrow asked quietly. Bronn nodded once, though his gut churned. Let's get on with it. He led the way to the primary tunnel, which yawned like a black maw. The faith militant began to pour in, a wave of chanting figures. Light from their torches flickered off the wet stone walls. Bronn directed them through twisting corridors, deeper than most had ever gone. The labyrinth's gloom swallowed them, thunder rumbling above. Suddenly, shouts erupted ahead. A barricade had been raised near one of the main junctions. Figures behind it loosed crossbow bolts into the line of zealots. Screams rang out as men fell. The faith militant surged forward, brandishing torches and cudgels. Within moments, a brutal melee filled the tunnel. Bronn pressed against the wall, cursing. The criminals had anticipated an assault. The tunnel lit with the glow of torches, revealing glistening water and the flash of steel. Cries of pain echoed. The zealots, driven by fanaticism, overran the barricade despite casualties. The criminals retreated, luring the faith deeper. Step by step, the High Sparrow's force advanced, encountering further resistance at each choke point. The labyrinth turned into a battlefield of ambushes and bottlenecks. Smoke from torches and the stench of blood filled the damp air. Echoes of furious chanting and desperate shouts reverberated off the walls. Bronn stayed near the vanguard, offering guidance when a passage forked. He was too busy surviving to track the body count. At times, criminals collapsed entire sections of tunnel behind them, burying zealots under rubble. At others, the faith pressed so hard that the criminals broke and fled, leaving corpses in their wake. Hours seemed to pass, though it might have been far less. Eventually, they reached the vast cistern, the rumored meeting place. The criminals were indeed gathered in numbers, forming a defensive ring around the central platform. Torches flickered on both sides, illuminating a scene of chaos. The criminals brandished swords, axes, crossbows. The faith militant raised cudgels, spears, makeshift shields. The High Sparrow's voice rang out, echoing across the cavern's vaulted ceiling. In the name of the Seven, yield, surrender your wicked ways, or face the Father's judgment. A harsh laugh echoed from the criminals' ranks. The hooded figure emerged, flanked by Crisp the Rat and Red Alistair. We will never surrender to your tyranny, the hooded leader roared back. "You cling to false righteousness. This city belongs to the free, not your fanatic illusions." A ragged cheer rose from the criminals. Then Crisp the rat shrieked, pointing, "It's Bronn! He led them here." A chorus of curses erupted. Several crossbowmen aimed at him. Bronn dived behind a stalagmite as bolts clattered against the stone. The faith militant bellowed a battle cry. With an unspoken signal, both sides charged across the stone platforms. A violent collision ensued, weapons clashing. The hooded leader brandished a wicked curved blade, cutting down two zealots in a swift flurry. Crisp scurried along the edge, stabbing with a dagger at any faith soldier who came near. Red Alistair barked orders to a cluster of crossbowmen, unleashing volley after volley into the fanatic ranks. The High Sparrow stood behind his line, praying aloud, as if each word bolstered his men's morale. Blood splashed the cistern water, screams filled the air. It was a savage fight, each side fueled by desperation or zeal. Bronn saw an opportunity. While both forces were locked in brutal combat, he slipped along the perimeter. He spotted Crisp the rat, who had ventured too close to the faith lines. The wiry criminal's eyes darted, searching for an escape. Bronn tackled him from behind, knocking the dagger from Crisp's hand. Crisp squealed, turning to see Bronn's hard gaze. "You bastard," Crisp hissed. "I'll kill you for this. The city will know your treachery." But Bronn pressed his blade to Crisp's throat. "Should have run when you had the chance," Bronn growled, then shoved Crisp into the path of a lunging zealot's weapon. The rat gave one last shriek. Bronn stepped back, letting the chaos swallow Crisp. He had no choice. Crisp would have sold him out in a heartbeat. Near the center, the hooded leader unleashed a terrifying display of skill, cutting through zealots who rushed him. The man moved like a dancer with a sword, agile and deadly. Red Alistair and his crossbowmen tried to provide covering fire. Meanwhile, the High Sparrow's forces swelled around them, chanting prayers, swinging cudgels with bone-crunching force. The criminals began to lose ground, forced toward the edge of the platform, where dark water lapped ominously. Bronn spied a set of barrels to one side, half submerged. Could that be the rumored fire or explosive they intended to use against the September? He inched closer, noticing the pitch-black residue seeping from one cask. Wildfire, or some other flammable. If a spark ignited here, the entire cistern might go up. Fear prickled his skin. Suddenly, the hooded leader seemed to realize the tide was turning. He roared, "Light the barrels! We'll bring down the roof on these zealots." One of the criminals rushed to obey. Bronn dashed forward, intercepting him with a swift slash that opened the man's throat. The man toppled, torch falling into the water with a hiss. Another criminal shoved Bronn from behind. He spun, parrying a scimitar strike. Their blades clanged in the torchlight, sliding off each other. Bronn kicked the criminal in the knee, causing him to stumble. A zealot seized the opening to bash the criminal's skull. The scene was utter carnage. A fierce shout came from behind Bronn. He turned just in time to see the hooded leader charging, curved blade raised. The figure's hood slipped back, revealing a gaunt woman with a scar across her jaw, her face contorted in hatred. "You traitorous dog!" she hissed, slashing at Bronn's chest. He barely dodged, feeling the blade slice his cloak. She pressed the attack with startling speed. He blocked, but she forced him backward, her eyes burning with fury. "I'll see you drown in your own blood," Sel's word. Bronn clenched his jaw, meeting her strikes with desperate parries. She was good, better than Farlin or Crisp. He recognized the stance of trained Bravosi water dancers, or some other foreign style. Each blow rattled his arm, but a cornered Bronn was still Bronn, cunning and ruthless. He feinted a block high, then pivoted, hooking her ankle with his boot. She stumbled, and Bronn buried his dagger in her side. She gasped, dropping to her knees. Her sword clattered on the stone. "Should have stayed hidden," Bronn muttered. She glared at him with seething contempt, blood trickling from her lips. He pulled the dagger free, letting her crumple. Looking around, he saw that the criminals' line had collapsed. The faith militant overwhelmed them, bodies strewn across the platform. A few criminals tried to flee into smaller tunnels, only to be cut down or dragged back. Red Alistair lay lifeless, riddled with crossbow bolts from his own side's confusion. The barrels of black substance remained unlit. Above, the vaulted ceiling dripped water. No cataclysmic explosion would claim the city today. In the center of the carnage, the High Sparrow walked calmly, touching the fallen zealots' foreheads, murmuring blessings for those who breathed their last. The survivors raised a ragged cheer. King's Landing's underworld had been dealt a mortal blow. The labyrinth was effectively subdued. Bronn sheathed his blade, stepping gingerly over blood-slick stones. He felt numb. Perhaps the city was safer. Perhaps not. But the war beneath the streets had reached its crescendo. He and the High Sparrow exchanged a glance. The old man gave a faint nod of acknowledgement. Bronn nodded back, neither triumphant nor relieved. Something in his gut told him that the city's troubles were far from over. Still, he had survived. For the moment, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the faith solidified its hold on King's Landing. Most of the major criminal ringleaders had been captured or killed. The labyrinth was patrolled by armed sparrows, who smashed any lingering pockets of resistance. Smuggling routes closed, contraband dried up, and the once thriving underworld lay in tatters. People whispered that the High Sparrow was the true power in the city, overshadowing even the Crown's authority. Some hailed him as a savior who cleansed King's Landing of sin. Others feared that he had become a dictator cloaked in piety. Regardless, Bronn had a measure of protection from the faith for now. He walked the streets unmolested, though some spat at his feet or cursed his name. Word had spread that he had helped the High Sparrow purge the underworld, but none dared challenge him openly, lest they incur the faith's wrath. One evening, Bronn visited a quiet courtyard near the starry September, where he knew the High Sparrow often came to reflect. He found the old man seated on a stone bench, gazing at a small fountain. Bronn approached, inclining his head. "Thought I'd find you here." The High Sparrow looked up, a gentle smile forming. "Sir Bronn, you look troubled." Bronn shrugged. "City's changed. Not sure it's for the better or worse, but it's changed." The High Sparrow dipped his fingers in the fountain's water, swirling lightly. Change is inevitable when sin is rooted out. There may be pain, but from that pain, a new order arises. The people will be safer, freer from the clutches of vice. Maybe, or maybe they'll just find new ways to commit sins. Bronn paused, arms folded. "I held up my end of the bargain. I helped you. Now I want your word that I can walk away from all this with no trouble." "You wish to leave King's Landing?" the High Sparrow asked, a note of curiosity in his tone. "Eventually, yes. I didn't come here to become a priest or some zealot. I did what you asked to survive. But a man like me thrives on moving before the next storm hits." The High Sparrow stood, letting the water drip from his fingertips. He studied Bronn's face. "You have been a valuable instrument of the Seven. You have served justice, protected the innocent from destruction. I wonder if you feel no calling to remain." "None," Bronn said flatly. "I've seen enough." A hint of sadness flickered in the High Sparrow's eyes. "Very well. We shall not impede your departure. You have my word. Though it pains me to see a soul who has tasted redemption turn away, I cannot force your faith." Bronn relaxed, relieved. "Thank you." The High Sparrow placed a hand on Bronn's shoulder. "Should you ever seek a return to the light, remember that the Seven are merciful. May the Mother grant you safety on your journey." Bronn almost laughed at the irony, but he bowed his head. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, he stepped away, heading for the courtyard's exit. As he walked, he felt the subtle weight of coin in his pouch. Coin he'd gathered from the labyrinth, from pockets of dead criminals, from caches discovered in hidden compartments. Not a fortune large enough to buy a castle, but enough to start anew somewhere outside the madness of King's Landing. He paused near the entrance, glancing back at the High Sparrow. The old man stood alone by the fountain, hands folded, posture bent as though carrying an invisible burden. Despite everything, Bronn felt a pang of something like pity. The High Sparrow, in his quest to purge sin, had transformed the city into a place of constant vigilance and fear. He might have believed it was for the people's good, but Bronn suspected that one tyranny had merely replaced another. Yet he was no saint. He'd done the deeds that put the High Sparrow in charge. Maybe that was just the nature of King's Landing. The game shifted, but the ruthlessness remained. The next day, as Bronn rode out of the city gates, he felt the eyes of the faith militant on high. And watchful, he did not look back. The labyrinth beneath the city was quiet now, or so they said, but its secrets would remain. In time, perhaps, new criminals would dare those depths, forging fresh alliances or stirring an even darker threat. The High Sparrow might remain in power for a while, or he might be brought low by the politics of the realm. Nothing lasted forever. The city devoured all illusions of permanence. Bronn knew that as well as anyone. Let them have King's Landing with its pious zeal and hidden darkness. He was done dancing on that knife's edge, at least for now. As he spurred his horse onward, the thought drifted through his mind. Had he truly served the High Sparrow all along, or had he served only himself? Perhaps it was both. He'd exploited his knowledge of the underworld to survive the new regime. In doing so, he had inadvertently delivered victory to the High Sparrow. He had become an instrument of a holy war he neither believed in nor cared for, except in how it kept him alive. That was the nature of Bronn's cunning. And if one day the city changed again, if the faith fell and another power rose, there would always be men like Bronn, ready to sell their knowledge for the right price. King's Landing's labyrinth had its secrets, but so did he. His horse's hooves clopped across the drawbridge, carrying him away from the stench and tension of the capital. Rain clouds loomed on the horizon. He smirked to himself. Another storm was coming, whether for the city or for him. But for the moment he was free. And if the High Sparrow had found a measure of victory, so too had Bronn. In the grand tapestry of betrayals and loyalties, that was enough. He did not serve the gods or the criminals or the lords. He served only the will to keep breathing, to keep profiting, to keep living on his own terms. That was Bronn's truth, the one truth he trusted above all else. And so he rode, leaving King's Landing in his wake, though he knew that even if he never returned, the whispers of his betrayal and his role in the High Sparrow's purge would echo through the streets he once knew. The tunnels might remain silent for a time, the criminals scattered, but eventually, life would go on. The city would spin another cycle of sin and redemption, blood and gold. Perhaps in another lifetime, Bronn might reappear to tap that same well of cunning. But until then, he slipped into the wider realm, content with the knowledge that he had survived yet another game in the City of Secrets. Bronn rode at a steady pace along the river road, leaving King's Landing and the tumult of the High Sparrow's regime behind him. His horse's hooves clopped over the packed mud and stones, forging a path through puddles left by the morning's rain. The city gates had vanished behind a bend some miles back, though his mind still lingered on that final glimpse of the capital. King's Landing, for all its vices, had been a source of opportunity. Dirty coins, bloody deals, high-born promises, but now it stood firmly in the grip of the faith. He told himself it was better to be gone. Even so, he could not entirely shake the disquieting echo of that labyrinth war, of Crisp the rat's shrill accusations, of the hooded woman's furious eyes. He had survived, but at a price. Knowledge that he had left a city under a fanatic's thumb. Perhaps that was just how things had to be. Better them than him. He nudged his horse into a canter, hoping to reach an inn before dusk. The first few days of travel were uneventful, marked by quiet farmland and sparse traffic on the road. Once in a while, he passed a dusty merchant's wagon heading for the city, and the drivers would wave politely or ignore him altogether. He kept his hood drawn low, feeling no need to publicize himself as Ser Bronn of the Blackwater, or to draw attention from any who might hold grudges. Memories of the labyrinth flickered unbidden. The swirl of torchlight, the stink of blood and stagnant water, the fear that one wrong turn might lead to a crossbow bolt in his spine. The faith had triumphed, courtesy of his knowledge. A part of him felt that all he had really done was shift the city from one tyranny to another. But perhaps there was a shred of difference. The criminals had meant to blow up half the September to gain leverage. The High Sparrow, for all his severity, had not threatened to kill thousands of innocents in a single stroke. Bronn could live with his choice, even if it made him a traitor in the eyes of the underworld. He told himself it was over now. The road stretched open, lined with shrubs and scattered pines. Storm clouds were receding in the distance, leaving the sky a dim shade of pewter. The day was calm enough to let him brood, but Bronn preferred to keep his mind on the next meal, the next opportunity. If the coin in his pouch could buy him a comfortable stay at a roadside inn, then that was enough for the moment. Around midday, he spotted a rising wisp of chimney smoke. He guessed it was an inn or a farmstead. Riding closer, he found an aging sign creaking in the breeze. A faded painting of a rearing stag with the words "The Stumbling Heart." The building itself looked worn, but from within came the sound of conversation and the smell of stew. Bronn's stomach grumbled. He dismounted, tethered his horse under a modest awning, and pushed through the door. Inside, the common room was small and dimly lit by two narrow windows. A scattering of wooden tables hosted travelers in cloaks, a few local farmers, and a pair of rough-looking men who eyed Bronn as he entered. The barkeep, a stout man with a thick beard, offered a curt nod. A serving girl moved between tables with a pot of stew, ladling portions into bowls. Bronn took a seat at the bar. The barkeep approached. "Stew and ale?" he asked, wiping his hands on an apron. "Aye," Bronn replied. He passed over a small coin, mindful not to flash too much silver. "If there's a room for the night, I'll take that too." The barkeep nodded. "You won't find better on this stretch, though that's not saying much." Bronn gave a wry smile. "I've had worse." Moments later, the serving girl placed a steaming bowl of thin stew before him, followed by a chipped mug of ale. He drank, letting the lukewarm bitterness wash down the taste of travel dust. Stew next, stringy meat, undersalted, but at least it was hot. He noticed the two rough-looking men in the corner shifting their attention back and forth between him and their whispered conversation. He kept his peripheral vision on them. They might be simple highwaymen, or they might recognize him from King's Landing. Either way, he had no intention of letting them slip a knife in his back. He ate quickly and, to forestall trouble, stood to claim his room early. The barkeep waved him toward a narrow staircase. Bronn ascended, found a cramped chamber with a straw pallet, a small table, and a single shuttered window looking out over the road. The place reeked slightly of damp wood, but it was a roof at least. He set down his pack, took a moment to ensure his sword belt hung within arm's reach, then sat on the pallet to rest. That night, he dozed fitfully, half expecting a rap at the door or a blade in the darkness. But no threat arrived. At dawn, he rose, paid the barkeep an extra coin for the trouble, and rode on. The next 2 days passed in a similar pattern. Riding, finding modest inns or the hospitality of local farmers, exchanging small talk about harvests and rumors. He avoided deep discussions of King's Landing. Some had heard that the faith militant was cleansing the city, and that many criminals had been put to the question. Opinions varied. Some thought it was high time the capital was rid of filth. Others worried the faith's power would grow too large. Bronn mostly listened, nodding occasionally. On the 4th day out, the countryside grew more remote. The rolling fields gave way to rocky hills, and the villages became sparser. Bronn found himself on a lonely stretch of road by late afternoon. The sun angled low, casting long shadows across a land dotted with scrub and craggy stones. An icy wind tugged at his cloak. He grimaced, suspecting that finding shelter might be a challenge. Sure enough, by sunset, he saw no sign of habitation, only a faint outline of some ruins atop a hill to the east. He pressed on, hoping the road might lead to a more welcoming spot, but the twilight thickened. Eventually, he decided he'd have to make camp. He guided his horse off the road toward the lee of a rocky outcrop. There, beneath an overhang, he found enough shelter to start a small fire. He fed the horse a few handfuls of oats, then settled down to chew on a bit of dried meat and stale bread. As the stars appeared, Bronn's thoughts wandered to the uncertain future. He had grown accustomed to existing in the margin between great powers. He'd served Tyrion Lannister once, had rubbed elbows with Jaime, had even brushed up against the complex web of Cersei's intrigues. But that felt like another life. The city's labyrinth had been the last of his big gambles, or so he told himself. Perhaps there were other lords who'd pay for his skill, but he was in no rush to kneel. He was no knight in shining armor. He was a sellsword, and a sellsword lived day to day. Wind hissed through the stones. He drew his cloak tighter and let the fire's embers glow. In the distance, some night bird called, a mournful cry. Bronn dozed, one eye open for predators. By morning, the wind had died, leaving a dawn sky streaked with pastel pink and gray. He packed up, mounted, and resumed his journey. Around midday, he encountered a ragged merchant with a donkey cart. The cart was stacked high with sacks of grain, and the merchant's brow glistened with sweat. He seemed relieved to see another traveler, even if that traveler looked like a seasoned fighter. "Hail, friend," the merchant called out. "You traveling north?" Bronn shrugged. "West. Thought to cut across. See if I can find the gold road eventually." "That's a fair distance." The merchant wiped his forehead. "If you pass the next fork, stay left. Right leads you deeper into these hills, and there have been bandits reported." Bronn gave a curt nod. "Any villages nearby?" The merchant shook his head. "None that I know of. You'll see a small watchtower in about half a day's ride, though I hear it's abandoned. Used to be part of a lord's estate, but no lord has claimed these lands in some time." Bronn flicked the reins. "Appreciate the warning." They parted ways and Bronn pressed on. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of pine. Now and then he thought about the watchtower. He had no desire to linger in a ruin, but it might offer some safer shelter than the open ground. As dusk fell, he spotted it. A squat, crumbling structure perched on a ridge, its stones mottled with moss. From a distance, it looked lifeless. The path leading up was overgrown with weeds. He decided it would suffice for the night. As he approached, he kept one hand near his sword, just in case some vagrant or wild animal had taken up residence. The watchtower's narrow windows gaped like hollow eyes. Dismounting at the threshold, he nudged the door with a foot. It creaked inward, revealing a single chamber with a rickety ladder leading to the upper level. Dust motes swirled in the last rays of sunlight. It smelled of old mold and damp stone. He led his horse around the side, finding a small enclosure where perhaps some stable or lean-to once stood. With a bit of effort, he cleared the debris and tethered the horse under partial cover. Then he set about exploring the tower. The ground floor was empty, save for a broken stool and some scattered straw that might once have been a bedding. The ladder climbed to a second level, where a portion of the stone roof remained intact. Bronn hoisted himself up, scanning for any sign of intruders. No one, just a battered brazier, missing its base, and more broken furniture. He sighed, somewhat relieved that it was vacant. He brought up a few pieces of wood from outside, likely rotted scraps, but enough to kindle a small flame in the remains of the brazier. Once lit, the feeble fire cast dancing shadows on the crumbling walls. Bronn unrolled a thin blanket, sat with his back to a cold stone, and ate the last of his dried rations. The horse below occasionally whickered, but otherwise, the hills outside were silent. Clouds drifted across the moon, offering faint beams of light that spliced through the windows. Sleep came slowly. He was used to sleeping lightly, but his mind turned over the uncertain path ahead. Perhaps he'd keep to the roads west, heading toward the Reach or the Westerlands, maybe even Dorne. He had once traveled with the Lannisters into Dorne. That memory made him grimace. On the other hand, if he roamed far enough, maybe he could find some petty lord who needed a sword hand, someone with enough gold to make it worthwhile. Or better yet, he could find a quiet corner of the Seven Kingdoms and simply lie low, turning the coin he'd pocketed from the labyrinth conflict into a modest farm or small business. The notion felt alien. Bronn as a farmer? He almost laughed in the darkness. Perhaps it was too late in life for him to become anything but a sellsword. He dozed off eventually, only to be startled awake by a faint sound below. The horse snorted, and Bronn heard hooves scraping on stone. He sat up, hand on the hilt of his dagger. The brazier's embers glowed faintly. For a moment, he thought the horse was just adjusting itself. Then he heard another noise, soft, shuffling footsteps. Bronn rose without a sound, creeping to the edge of the opening in the floor where the ladder descended. Peering down, he saw vague shapes in the gloom, moving near his horse. The animal tossed its head nervously. A spark of moonlight glinted on something metallic, perhaps a blade. "Easy, boy," a voice whispered, barely audible. "We'll have you unbound, and we'll be off with you before your master wakes." Two silhouettes. Thieves, most likely. One was working at the knot of the horse's tether, while the other kept watch, a short blade in his hand. Bronn's eyes narrowed. He was not about to let them steal his horse, nor was he eager to let them call out for reinforcements if they spotted him. He considered his options. He could climb down the ladder quietly and risk being heard on the final steps. Or he could drop from the second-level opening if there was a ledge outside. He glanced at the nearest window slit. If he slipped through, he might drop into the enclosure from behind. Quietly, he shuffled toward it, checking the drop. It was no more than a man's height to the ground. He slid one leg out, bracing himself, then the other, letting himself dangle. The horse was just around the corner. The night air was cold on his cheeks. He released his grip and landed in a crouch, muffling the thud as best he could. Now he could hear the thieves more clearly as he rounded the corner of the old wall. "Hurry," one hissed. "Don't want to be here all night." "Shut it," the other snapped. "The damned knot is tight." Bronn drew his sword in one hand and his dagger in the other, creeping up behind them. The horse twitched, but it was used to his scent, so it did not spook. At the last moment, a bit of gravel slid under his boot, and the second thief half-turned. But Bronn was upon him, striking with the pommel of his sword rather than the blade. The metal connected with a sharp crack against the man's temple. He dropped instantly, out cold. The other thief whirled around, clutching a short dagger. "Who?" the thief began, but Bronn lunged, hooking his dagger around the man's forearm to deflect the blow. Then, with a swift twist, he pressed his sword's point to the thief's throat. The man froze, trembling. "Quiet," Bronn growled, "or you die here." The thief's eyes were wide, reflecting the faint moonlight. He was young, barely more than a boy, with a patchy beard. "We didn't mean any harm, sir. Just needed a horse." Bronn snorted. "And you thought you'd help yourselves to mine? Mercy," the thief pleaded. "We got no coin for a new mount. We had to run, because—" Bronn applied a little pressure, drawing a bead of blood at the thief's throat. "I don't care for excuses." He glanced at the unconscious thief sprawled on the ground. "What about him?" "My brother," the young man said, voice shaky. "We were on the run. Got in trouble with some local bandits. We refused to join them, so they took everything we had." Bronn arched a brow. "So you decided to become thieves yourselves. A fitting turn, I suppose." The young thief's eyes flicked to his unconscious brother. "I beg you, let us go, or at least let me tend him. We're starving, no place to stay. If you'll just spare us." Bronn weighed the words. He'd seen desperation before, and indeed, these two looked like they'd missed many meals. Their clothes were ragged, their cheeks sunken. If they'd tried to steal his horse for survival, that was hardly new in these lands. He almost considered letting them go. But he also knew that mercy wasn't always wise. They might come back with friends or try again. He sighed. "Untie that knot you were working on." The thief blinked, confused. "Sir, I said untie it tighter. Tie your brother's hands. That's my condition if you want to walk away alive. Bind him up and drag him off the moment he wakes. You can keep your pathetic dagger. No, actually, toss that over there." The thief complied, tossing the dagger into the dirt. Then, trembling, he looped the rope around his brother's wrists, making a makeshift bind. Bronn kept his sword at the ready. "Now lift him up. You're walking out of here, and you'll keep walking until you can't see this tower anymore. Then you can let him go. But if you try anything—" He left the threat unfinished. With difficulty, the thief hauled his unconscious brother into a half-upright position. The older sibling groaned, dazed, but he seemed alive enough to move with support. They stumbled away into the darkness, the younger thief casting one last fearful glance over his shoulder at Bronn. Then they vanished into the gloom, footsteps scraping on rocks. Bronn exhaled, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He sheathed his weapons, patting the horse's flank. "You all right, boy?" The animal snorted, still anxious from the intrusion. Bronn checked the rope, retied it securely to the battered post, and retrieved the thieves' fallen dagger. A worthless piece of iron, but he chucked it aside so it wouldn't be used again. He returned to the tower, climbed up, and spent the rest of the night alert, sword across his lap. He doubted the thieves would come back. Two half-starved youths with no gear didn't stand a chance if he was awake, but caution was his nature. By the time morning light filtered through the crumbling windows, Bronn was stiff and tired. He decided it was time to move on. The tower's location had proven too obvious for brigands. Riding again, he continued northwest, guided by the merchant's directions. The wind was gentler, and the sky had cleared to a crisp pale blue. He saw hawks circling overhead, riding updrafts. The landscape gradually changed from rocky hills to patches of forest, the underbrush thickening. A few hours passed. Then, just as the merchant had said, the road forked. One path curved right, plunging deeper into wooded hills. The other veered left. The signpost was old, with faded letters. Bronn chose left. By late afternoon, he spotted a hamlet in the distance, perhaps 24 huts and 1 or 2 small structures that might be shops. The smoke of hearth fires rose overhead, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with cooking meat drifted to his nose. He urged his horse onward, thinking a hot meal sounded better than another night of dried rations and watchful tension. He reached the hamlet's outskirts, passing a few scrawny pigs that rooted in the mud. The peasants he saw gave him wary looks. A stranger was unusual in such a small place, especially one bearing steel. Nonetheless, Bronn kept his manner calm, offering a nod here and there. Eventually, he found a small building with a hand-painted sign that read shelter and mead. It was more shack than inn, but smoke billowed from its chimney, so it would do. He dismounted, tied the horse to a nearby post, and stepped inside. The interior was cramped. A single large room with a hearth, a handful of rough tables, and an older woman stirring a pot at the fire. She turned as he entered, arching an eyebrow. "Looking for a bite and maybe a spot to bed down," Bronn said. She sized him up. "We ain't got proper rooms. Just a spot on the floor if you can pay." He shrugged. "I can pay." She nodded. "Sit, then." He sat on a stool near the hearth while she ladled out a bowl of thick stew. This time, the smell was richer. Perhaps they had decent stock. He tasted it, pleasantly surprised by the flavor of onion and herbs. While he ate, the woman poured a cup of mead from a small cask. Bronn sipped it cautiously. It was sweet, with a bit of a fermented aftertaste, but far from the worst he'd had. A handful of locals milled about, mostly older men and women with lined faces, wearing simple homespun attire. 1 or 2 cast curious glances at Bronn, but none approached him. The air felt subdued, as though overshadowed by worry. He wondered if bandits or even the Faith's arms had reached this far. As the evening wore on, a few more villagers came in, filling the room with quiet chatter. Bronn caught fragments of conversation. Complaints about taxes, though he couldn't guess which lord was extracting them, as the hamlet didn't seem to have a direct overseer. Murmurs of missing livestock, a rumor about a traveling witch who had sold worthless charms to some gullible farmer. Typical talk for a remote place. Eventually, as the darkness settled, the locals drifted out. The old woman pointed Bronn to a corner of the room where a straw pallet lay. It was clearly used for travelers, though seldom, judging by the dust. He tossed a coin her way, more than enough to cover the stew, mead, and the lodging. She accepted it with a nod, not bothering to thank him. He didn't mind. Civility wasn't a currency worth fussing over in such places. Before bedding down, he stepped outside to check on his horse. The moon lit the tiny hamlet, revealing the shapes of huts and a small well in the center. A dog barked somewhere. Bronn listened for any sign of trouble. Nothing stirred. Satisfied, he returned and lay on the pallet, cloak draped over him. The crackling hearth lulled him toward sleep. He dreamed of the labyrinth again. In the dream, he wandered dark corridors alone, hearing water drip, hearing Crisp the rat's voice echo, mocking. Then the corridor split into 7 passages, each one lit by a flickering torch. He followed one at random, only to find the high Sparrow at the end, standing in silent judgment. Then the corridor walls closed in, and Bronn woke with a start. He realized the fire had burned low, leaving only embers. He exhaled, cursing under his breath, and turned over. It was too late for regrets. Dawn came, and with it a decision. Bronn resolved to keep heading west, maybe aim for Golden Grove or the Mander region. The Tyrell domain was relatively wealthy, though the faith's ties to Marjorie Tyrell might complicate matters. Still, the region might offer some new opportunity for a sellsword who kept his head down. He thanked the old woman, grunted his thanks, and departed. The hamlet barely stirred as he passed through. On the outskirts, he noticed a rickety shrine to the Seven, but it looked neglected, the paint peeling and a ragged crow perched on its roof. He wondered if news of the faith's power in the capital had reached these folk and soured their devotion, or if they were simply too poor to maintain the shrine. The day's ride was peaceful. He skirted a shallow river, crossing at a narrow ford. By midday, the land began to transition to broader meadows, dotted with small copses of oak and beech. He saw a few more travelers now, an ox-drawn cart loaded with lumber, a handful of men on foot carrying sacks of grain, and once a pair of mounted men wearing mismatched armor. They regarded him warily but rode on. By evening, he came upon a larger road. It was not the Gold Road, but it was well-trodden. He followed it southward a while, suspecting it would intersect with a major route soon. The next morning, he reached a crossroad marked with a freshly painted sign. One arrow pointed southwest to High Garden, another southeast to King's Landing, and a third north to Casterly Rock. So he was indeed in the fringes of the Reach. He considered heading to High Garden. Mace Tyrell was a pompous windbag, but the region around it was fertile and coin might flow freely. Yet he was in no mood to tangle with the Tyrells' intrigues, especially given their uncertain alliance with the Faith. He turned his horse west, deciding to keep his distance from major seats of power. In truth, he was drifting, uncertain of a final destination. Perhaps that was all right. A man like him didn't need a final destination, only the next vantage point. On the second day traveling that route, the weather turned sour. Rain pelted the land, turning the road to slick mud. Bronn cursed, pulling his hood tight as water dripped down his nose. His horse plodded onward, each hoofstep squelching. The countryside blurred, miserable in the downpour. He resolved to find shelter before nightfall. Fortune smiled a bit. By late afternoon, he spied the silhouette of a small holdfast on a rise above the road. A crude wooden palisade surrounded a cluster of buildings, and beyond it, a single tower rose from the center, a modest keep, presumably the seat of a minor lord. Smoke drifted from the tower's chimney, indicating life. Bronn approached the gates, where a pair of guards under a dripping awning held spears. They looked decidedly unimpressive, older men wearing patched leather jerkins, their spears showing spots of rust. "Halt!" one called. "What's your business?" Bronn reined in, looking for shelter from this storm. "Got coin if your lord is willing to rent a corner of his stable." The guards exchanged glances. One shrugged. "We don't often take in strangers. Name yourself." "Bronn," he said simply, omitting the titles. The guards seemed none the wiser. "Wait here." One guard lifted the gate's crossbar and stepped inside, presumably to inform someone. Bronn rubbed his face, water trickling down. He wasn't in a mood to brandish a reputation. For all he knew, these folk might serve a house that disliked him. The guard returned, waving him in. Ser Cleve says you can stay the night in the courtyard, but you'll have to speak with him first. Ser Cleve, is he your lord? The guard smirked. Lord Tyndale is the master here, but he's too ill to be seeing travelers. Ser Cleve is Castellan. Bronn nodded, guiding his horse through the open gate. Inside, a muddy courtyard stretched between the wooden walls and the central keep. A few small outbuildings huddled near the perimeter. Storehouses, a smithy, and a stable that looked in disrepair. A handful of peasants sloshed through the mud with sacks of grain. Another guard approached, leading Bronn to a covered walkway near the keep's entrance. There stood Ser Cleve, a tall man with thinning hair and a pot belly, dressed in a half-rusted breastplate. He wore a sword at his side and a pinched expression on his face. So you seek lodging, do you? Ser Cleve said, eyeing Bronn skeptically. You a sellsword? Something like that, Bronn replied. I'm traveling west. Got caught in the rain. The Castellan sniffed. We've no rooms to spare, but the stable has some dry space if you don't mind the smell. You can have a meal from the kitchens for a few coppers. If you cause trouble, we'll toss you out. Understood. Bronn fished out a small coin. I've no quarrel with you, just need a place to stay dry. Ser Cleve pocketed the coin with a curt nod. See to your horse. The stable boys will take over once you're settled. You can sup in the hall with my men, but don't pester Lord Tyndale. Wouldn't dream of it. Bronn led his horse to the stable, which had 6 stalls, most of them empty. The roof leaked in places, but at least it was better than being out in the open. A bored-looking stable boy came to help remove the saddle, then scattered fresh hay in a stall. Bronn rubbed the horse's muzzle, muttering reassurance, then shook off his cloak, spattering water on the floor. He stepped outside, into the gloom of the courtyard. The keep's interior was a cramped stone tower, only 2 levels above ground. The main hall was a plain space with a wooden table, a soot-stained fireplace, and battered tapestries that might have once depicted hunts or battles, but now were too faded to tell. A half-dozen men-at-arms lounged at the table, drinking ale from clay cups. Ser Cleve took a seat at the head. A servant ladled watery soup into bowls and doled out hunks of bread. Bronn, dripping and weary, took a seat on a bench at the far end. No one seemed eager to talk. The men-at-arms gave him the kind of sideways look they reserved for unknown sellswords. Bronn responded with a polite nod and focused on his soup, which was bland but hot. You traveling alone? One man-at-arms finally ventured. Better that way, Bronn said shortly, not volunteering details. You come from the east? Bronn nodded, slurping soup. Another man, older and bearded, spat on the floor. Heard troubles brewing in the east. The faith's gone mad, so they say. Tarring and feathering whores, locking up blasphemers. Bronn did not react visibly. So they say, he replied, keeping his tone neutral. The older man snorted. Hope they keep their madness in the city. We got enough problems. What problems? Bronn asked casually, though he wasn't certain he cared. Ser Cleve answered with a sneer. Bandits. Raids on local farms. They claim they've got no lord to answer to, so they do as they please. Lord Tyndale's been ill for months. Can barely stand. We're down to a handful of men. We'd pay good coin to have them cleared out, but we've not the gold to hire an army. That piqued Bronn's interest slightly. Where are these bandits holed up? Somewhere in the foothills south of here, the Castellan said, swirling his ale. They strike quickly, vanish into the terrain. We can't spare men to chase them. Another slurp of soup. Bronn considered the possibility of a small job. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if these bandits were half-starved amateurs, he might pick off a few, gather some spoils, maybe earn a reward from the Castellan. Yet the Castellan's mention that they had no real coin gave him pause. He shrugged. Tough luck for you. Ser Cleve's lips thinned. Tougher for the farmers, and for those passing through. But if you're not interested in helping, keep your opinions. Bronn smirked. I've got no quarrel with bandits, so long as they don't steal my horse. A tense silence fell. The men-at-arms resumed their quiet drinking. Bronn finished his soup, sopped up the last bit with bread, and stood. I'll see myself out, he said, turning to leave. The courtyard was all mud and darkness. Rain still pattered on the palisade. A lone torch sputtered by the stable entrance. Bronn climbed the external wooden stairs to the keep's second level, where he'd been told there was a corner for him to sleep. He found it easily enough, a small storeroom with a straw pallet, better than the stable floor. 2 barrels of old grain sat in one corner, their lids askew. Water dripped from a crack in the ceiling. He lay on the pallet, listening to the rain and faint thunder. The thought of these local bandits stuck in his mind. If the region was truly unprotected, it might be teeming with outlaws. That was no real threat to him, as he could handle himself. But it might complicate travel west. Perhaps there was a path south that bypassed them. Then again, bandit gold was as good as any, if one had the steel to take it. Maybe he could glean the bandits' location, ambush them, loot their hideout. He dozed with that notion in mind, uncertain if it was worth the risk. Come morning, he decided to ask a few discreet questions. It never hurt to gather knowledge. At dawn, the sky still wept drizzle, though the downpour had lessened. Bronn roused himself, strapped on his sword, and ventured downstairs. The main hall was nearly empty, just a single servant cleaning bowls. He found Ser Cleve in the courtyard, inspecting a broken cartwheel. 2 men-at-arms hovered nearby, shifting their weight in boredom. Bronn approached. These bandits, he said by way of greeting. They raid at night or day? Ser Cleve glanced at him. Mostly at night, hitting isolated farmsteads. They've carried off livestock and even tried to abduct a farmer's daughter, though she fought them off. Why do you ask? I'm heading west. Don't want to be caught unawares. Cleve scoffed. Then watch your back. They have lookouts on the ridges, or so we think. Bronn grunted. Any idea who leads them? One calls himself Varric the Red, Cleve said, the name spoken with clear disgust. Used to be a soldier in some minor lord's retinue, but turned to banditry when his lord lost a skirmish. He's rumored to have 12 men with him. 12's not many. Enough to harass peasants and outrun us in the hills, Cleve retorted. Lord Tyndale can't muster more than half a dozen men healthy enough to fight, and we can't afford to lose them on a chase. Bronn nodded, an idea forming. If I were to take them out, might that be worth a reward? Ser Cleve's eyes narrowed. You're offering to do that alone? If I found them, I'd want a bounty or the right to claim whatever they have. One of the men-at-arms snorted. Bold, aren't you? Bronn shrugged. I'm not a charity. If you've got nothing to offer, I'll keep riding. Ser Cleve studied Bronn's stance. We don't have much gold, as I said. But if you manage to bring back proof that Varric the Red and his men won't trouble these lands again, we could find you some coin from the keep's coffers. And you could keep whatever you loot from the bandits. That might suffice, Bronn said. But first, I'd need to know where to look. Cleve frowned. We suspect they lurk in the southern ridges, near a place called the Smokestone Ravine. The local shepherds say they've seen fires there at night, but we haven't confirmed. Point me in the right direction. Cleve gestured vaguely south. The ridges start about 3 leagues away, beyond the orchard. You'll see a path leading into rocky uplands. The ravine is further in, about a half-day's ride. Bronn rubbed his chin. All right, I'll give it a try. If I don't return in a few days, assume I died or changed my mind. The Castellan nodded. Fair enough. He paused, then added stiffly, if you do manage to rid us of Varric, you'll have our thanks. Bronn gave a half-smile, then turned to tend his horse. He checked the saddle straps, ensured his sword and dagger were in good shape. A small part of him wondered if this was a fool's errand, charging into unknown territory, alone to face a bandit crew. But he reasoned that it might be a quick way to earn a tidy sum and potentially gather even more from the bandit stash, if they had one. That coin could keep him comfortable for weeks or months, maybe enough to skip the next few fights. Besides, a dozen men wasn't so daunting if he was clever. He'd faced worse. He rode out of Tyndale's holdfast by mid-morning, heading south under a gray sky that threatened more rain. The orchard Cleve mentioned stood on a gentle slope, rows of twisted apple trees with early blossoms. Beyond, the land grew wilder, the road narrower. By noon, Bronn found a faint trail leading into the hills. Patches of low mist clung to rocky outcrops, giving the place an eerie feel. He pressed on, scanning the terrain. The path wound between boulders and stunted pines. Occasionally, he dismounted to lead the horse over slippery patches. The further he went, the quieter it became. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. As evening approached, he found a small clearing near a trickling stream. He set camp there, building a tiny fire behind a rock outcrop to hide the light. He didn't want to announce himself to any watchers. That night, the sky cleared enough to reveal a scattering of stars. Bronn crouched by the fire, chewing on some jerky and stale bread, eyes scanning the darkness. At times, he thought he glimpsed movement among the rocks, but it could have been wind-blown branches or illusions cast by flickering shadows. His nerves prickled. He recalled Crisp the rat stealth in the labyrinth. If these bandits had half the cunning Crisp once showed, they might be creeping up on him even now. But no one attacked. Dawn broke, and Bronn resumed his search, climbing higher into the ridges. The trail became less distinct, splitting at random intervals. He chose whichever direction seemed to angle toward a valley or a hidden hollow, suspecting that bandits would favor a secluded base. By midday, the sun shone bright, banishing the last of the drizzle. At length, he came upon a vantage point atop a rocky rise. Looking down, he saw a winding ravine filled with gnarled trees and loose scree. Smoke curled from somewhere within, faint and gray against the blue sky. Campsite, perhaps. He tied his horse behind a screen of boulders and began a cautious descent on foot. He clung to the edges of the ravine, moving slowly, scanning for sentries. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin. As he neared a bend, he heard voices, a low murmur, punctuated by laughter. Creeping closer, he found an outcrop that overlooked a small clearing at the ravine's bottom. There, tucked against a rock wall, stood a cluster of lean-tos and a couple of ragged tents. He counted at least 8 or 9 figures milling about. Some sharpened weapons, others tended a cooking fire. A pair of tethered horses grazed on patchy grass. Bronn crouched, heart pumping. If Varric the Red was here, the rest of his men likely were nearby. He doubted they'd all be lazing in the open. Some might be on patrol. He scanned the perimeter. One bandit sat atop a large boulder on the far side, a crossbow by his side, presumably a sentry. Another man, armed with a spear, paced near the lean-tos. He needed to decide how to approach this. A direct assault by himself would be suicidal if all the bandits joined the fight at once. But if he could pick off the sentry and cause confusion, maybe they'd scatter or break into smaller groups. Alternatively, he could try to lure them out, create a distraction. As he weighed options, a man emerged from one of the tents. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a mane of red hair and a scar across his right cheek. He wore a battered breastplate. The other bandits seemed to defer to him, glancing his way for direction. Bronn guessed this was Varric the Red. Varric walked to the fire, picked up a chunk of meat, and took a bite. He barked a few words to a younger bandit, who nodded and jogged off into the trees, perhaps on some errand. Then Varric turned to the others, gesturing with the meat as he spoke. Bronn, and could not make out the words, but it sounded like instructions or plans. Bronn settled in, deciding to observe a bit longer. Patience was not his strongest virtue, but rushing in would be foolish. He needed a clear plan. As the bandits moved about, he noticed what looked like a small cave entrance beyond the tents, partially hidden by brush. That might be where they stored loot, or where more men lurked. He inched backward from his vantage, careful not to loosen any pebbles. Then he circled around, searching for a better angle or a second approach. The ravine's walls were steep in places, but there were outcrops he could climb. Eventually, he found a narrow ledge that curved around the northern edge, offering a view of the cave entrance. A single bandit stood nearby, leaning on a spear, looking bored. If the bandits stored their stolen goods in that cave, it might also be their fallback. If threatened, they could retreat and defend it, turning the narrow entrance into a choke point. Bronn frowned. He might need to draw them away. After another quarter hour of silent observation, he saw a group of 3 bandits gear up and leave the camp, following the main trail out of the ravine. That left maybe 6 or 7 in sight. If the absent men were typical, that meant the entire band numbered around a dozen. He might never find a better time to strike. But how? One possibility: cause a commotion with the horses. If he spooked them or cut them loose, it might draw some men away from the cave. Or sabotage the sentry on the boulder first, then pick off others with ranged attacks, though Bronn didn't have a bow, just a crossbow he'd looted once or twice in the past, which he no longer carried. Another approach might be to wait until night, slip into the camp while they slept. But that risked them setting watchers. He decided on a simpler tactic: kill the sentry on the boulder, sow panic, and see who rushed to investigate. Then he might slip closer to the cave or pick off stragglers. Of course, that meant he needed to get behind the boulder unseen. Bronn spent another hour circling the ravine, measuring the paths. The sun sank lower, shadows lengthened, and the bandits' campsite took on a red hue in the fading light. Finally, he found a game trail that wound around the far side, leading up behind the sentinel's perch. It required careful climbing, but Bronn was nimble enough. He crouched behind a jagged rock, about 15 feet above the sentry. The man with the crossbow lounged on the boulder, occasionally standing to scan the ravine or the surrounding ridges. Bronn waited for the man to stand again, then timed his movement. When the sentry turned his back, Bronn slid down, dagger in hand, landing softly. He lunged before the man could turn, clamping one hand over the bandit's mouth and driving the dagger between the ribs. A gurgling gasp escaped the sentry as he toppled, crossbow falling to the stone with a dull clunk. Bronn exhaled slowly, muscles taut. He checked the edge of the boulder. No one below seemed to notice. The rest of the bandits were busy around the fire or near the cave. He pulled the sentry's limp body out of sight, easing it onto the ledge. Then he retrieved the crossbow, a crude thing with a half-full quiver of bolts. That might prove useful. From this vantage, he had a clear shot at the bandits below. They were scattered no more than 50 feet away. Varric was busy rummaging through a crate near the fire. Another bandit had just approached him, carrying what looked like a leather satchel. If Bronn picked off one with the crossbow, the rest would scatter or charge up. If they split up, he could whittle them down. He balanced the crossbow on the boulder's edge, loaded a bolt, and took careful aim at Varric the Red. The large man's breastplate might deflect a direct shot, but if he hit a vulnerable spot, Varric's throat or face, he could end this quickly. Bronn controlled his breathing, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The bolt hissed through the air. A fraction of a second later, Varric turned slightly. The bolt clanged against the metal of his breastplate, embedding itself at an angle without full penetration. Varric staggered but did not fall, letting out a roar of pain and surprise. Instantly, the camp erupted into chaos. The bandit nearest Varric dropped the satchel and scrambled for cover. Another bandit shouted, "Up there!" They must have spotted the bolt's trajectory. Bronn cursed under his breath and began loading another bolt, but the crossbow's mechanism was old and stiff. While he wrestled with it, one of the bandits fired a short bow, the arrow whizzing overhead. Bronn loosed his second bolt hastily, striking a different bandit in the shoulder. The man collapsed with a scream. Then Bronn tossed the crossbow aside and scrambled back up the boulder slope. He'd have to lure them away. Angry shouts rose from below. "Up there, he's climbing! Kill him! Varric, are you all right?" Bronn heard the red-haired leader cursing, promising a slow death for whoever ambushed them. Bronn ducked behind a ridge. An arrow clattered on rock near his head. He pressed himself against the ground. From the corner of his eye, he saw 3 bandits scaling the path, weapons drawn. He considered fleeing back the way he came, but that might lead him straight into the arms of another patrol. Instead, he set his jaw, drew his sword, and prepared to fight on the high ground. The first bandit to appear was a wiry man brandishing a scimitar. Bronn rose, slashed across the man's forearm, and kicked him off the ledge. The man tumbled with a startled cry. The second bandit lunged with a spear. Bronn twisted, parrying with his blade, then stepped in to thrust his dagger into the bandit's chest. The bandit gurgled, eyes wide, and slid off the steel. The third bandit hesitated at the sight, giving Bronn time to pivot and slash. The man managed to raise a small buckler, partially blocking the blow. Bronn hammered the buckler with a follow-up strike, pushing the man off balance. Then he seized the bandit's collar and yanked him forward, driving a knee into his groin. The bandit gasped, and Bronn finished him with a thrust to the throat. Breathing hard, Bronn glanced down. The wiry bandit who'd fallen off the ledge moaned, rolling in pain a few yards below. Another arrow whizzed by, reminding Bronn that more men remained. He ducked, scanning the ravine. Varric stood near the tents, blood trickling from beneath his breastplate, but still upright. For other bandits formed a line, bows at the ready. One loosed an arrow, forcing Bronn to flatten himself on the ridge. He cursed. If he stayed put, they'd pin him down or climb around to flank him. He needed to keep moving. The crossbow he'd discarded was behind him, probably empty anyway. He risked a quick peek. Two of the archers advanced, covering each other. Varric shouted at them to flush him out. Bronn decided a feint was needed. He sprang to his feet and sprinted along the ridge, ignoring the arrows that hissed past. Then he dropped out of sight behind another outcrop, circling around. If he could get below them, perhaps slip around to the cave entrance, he might catch them off guard. Scrabbling down a slope of loose gravel, he nearly lost his footing, sliding into a narrow gully. More shouts echoed as the bandits tried to track him. He spotted one man creeping along the edge above, scanning the rocks. The man's back was partially turned. Bronn scrambled up the far side, emerged behind the bandit, and stabbed him through the kidney before he could cry out. The man collapsed, twitching. Now Bronn saw Varric from a closer angle, perhaps 20 feet away across the rocky ground. The big man locked eyes with him, fury blazing. He hefted a broadsword in one hand. Blood still oozed from where the crossbow bolt had lodged in his armor. Two archers stood behind him, arrows notched. Another man to Varric's right carried an axe. "Who are you?" Varric roared. "One of Tyndale's curs? Or just a fool with a death wish?" Bronn smirked. "I heard you're worth gold if I kill you. Figured I'd give it a go." Varric bared his teeth. "You made a mistake. You're alone." Bronn shrugged. "Never needed a crowd to handle the likes of you." Varric let out a snarl, gesturing for his men to fan out. The archers advanced slowly, arrows aimed at Bronn's center. If they loosed at once, he couldn't dodge both. He needed to break their formation. He backpedaled, leading them behind a boulder. One arrow zipped by, grazing his shoulder. Pain lanced through him, but the wound seemed shallow. He hissed in annoyance. Another arrow clattered off the stone. Varric charged around the boulder, broadsword raised. Bronn sidestepped, parrying the initial swing. The force of it jolted up his arm. Varric was strong. The bandit leader pivoted, slashing horizontally. Bronn ducked, feeling the rush of air. He retaliated with a thrust that glanced off Varric's breastplate, scraping the metal. "You'll bleed soon enough," Bronn taunted. Varric growled, slamming his pommel at Bronn's face. Bronn twisted, but it caught his jaw, sending a jolt of pain through his teeth. He staggered back, cursing. Varric pressed the attack, chopping down. Bronn raised his sword to block, bracing with both hands. Metal rang on metal, and Bronn's knees nearly buckled. An arrow whistled overhead, missing both of them. The archers were trying to find a clear shot, but Varric's body blocked their aim. Bronn seized the chance, feigning weakness. As Varric hammered again, Bronn sidestepped and lashed out with his dagger, aiming for the gap in the bandit's armpit. The blade sank into flesh. Varric roared, stumbling, his broadsword swinging wildly. Bronn ducked as it whirred over his head, then wrenched the dagger free. Varric's eyes flashed with pain and rage. Blood dripped down his side. He lunged, but his strength was already flagging. Bronn sidestepped once more, letting Varric's momentum carry him forward. Then he slashed the back of Varric's calf. The big man went down on one knee with a howl. "Bastard!" Varric spat, spittle flying. Bronn lifted his sword. "At least you won't be robbing farmers anymore." Then he drove the blade forward, piercing Varric's throat. Blood spurted, and the bandit leader collapsed in a gargling heap. An arrow zipped past, nearly hitting Bronn's shoulder. He dropped to the ground behind Varric's corpse, using it as partial cover. The archers, still 2 in number, loosed again. One arrow thunked into Varric's lifeless back. Bronn rolled to the side, hurling his dagger at one of the archers. It flew wide, clattering on stone. The bandit grinned, drawing another arrow. That grin vanished as Bronn lunged forward. Before the man could release, Bronn swatted the bow aside with his sword, then drove the pommel into the archer's temple. The bandit collapsed. The final archer cursed, dropping his bow to grab a short sword. But Bronn was already upon him. They exchanged a quick flurry of blows. The archer's technique was clumsy. Bronn parried easily and slashed across the man's chest. The bandit stumbled, blood streaming. A final thrust, and he joined Varric in death. The ravine fell silent, save for the ragged pant of Bronn's breath. He wiped sweat from his brow, scanning the area for more threats. One bandit with a shattered leg moaned in the distance, probably the wiry man who'd fallen off the ledge. Bronn decided to leave him to his fate. Another might be skulking around, but it seemed the bulk of Varric's men were neutralized. Carefully, Bronn checked the bodies, stripping coin pouches and anything of value. He found a handful of silver stags and copper pennies, a few cheap rings, and a decent dagger with a jeweled hilt. Varric's broadsword looked battered. Bronn left it. He moved toward the tents, sword still in hand. No signs of life inside. The cooking fire smoldered, half kicked over. He rummaged through the crates, finding some dried meat, a few lumps of cheese, and mundane supplies. Nothing worth hauling except for rations. Then he spied the cave entrance. Stepping inside cautiously, he found a cramped passage leading to a natural chamber. Torches in sconces cast dancing shadows. A few small chests sat against the wall. One was open, revealing a scattering of coins, a couple of silver goblets, and some gold jewelry, likely spoils from their raids. Bronn grinned. This was his real reward. He rifled through the loot quickly, transferring the most valuable items. A small bag of coin, the goblets, some jewelry into a sack. Not too heavy, but enough to be worth the trouble. Another chest contained cheap copper utensils and battered tankards, worthless. A third chest was locked. He pried it open with a sword tip. Inside, he found a single purse of coins and a piece of cloth embroidered with a sigil he didn't recognize. Perhaps a noble family's crest. He shrugged and took the coin. A faint scuff behind him made him spin, sword raised. At the cave mouth stood a figure, half hidden in shadow. A slight shape, possibly a younger woman or older girl, trembling, hands lifted. She wore rough clothes. "Don't kill me," she gasped. "I'm not one of them. They forced me." Bronn eyed her warily. "You part of this band?" She shook her head frantically. "They took me from a farm 2 weeks ago. They made me cook for them, threatened to kill my mother if I ran." Her voice trembled, eyes wide with fear. He paused, scanning her face for deception. She looked truly terrified, her cheek bruised. Could be a trick, but it seemed genuine. "If you're lying." "I'm not. Please, I just want to go home." Bronn lowered his sword, though he did not sheath it. "Where is your home?" "A hamlet near Tyndale's Holdfast, called Grange Hill." He snorted softly. "I know the Holdfast. If you want, you can leave. The men here are dead or dying." She looked past him at the crates. "Are there more of them outside?" "Maybe 1 or 2 still breathing, but none in fighting shape." She sagged with relief, tears forming. "7 bless you." Bronn almost laughed at that. The 7 had nothing to do with it. She stepped into the chamber, glancing at the chests. "They took everything from my farm, a father's tools, mother's ring. Maybe it's here." Bronn shrugged. "Search if you want. I won't stop you." He picked up his sack of loot and turned to leave. The girl rummaged through the scattered items, letting out a small cry when she found a simple copper ring. She clutched it like a treasure. Bronn stepped back into the ravine, the light stinging his eyes after the torchlit cave. The bodies of bandits lay where they fell. The smell of blood was thick. He whistled for his horse, which he'd left hidden behind the boulders above. It took a few minutes for him to navigate back up the slope, mindful of the wet stones. He encountered no further resistance, though he remained cautious. At last, he reached his horse, tethered and restless. He patted its flank, then slung the sack of loot over the saddle. His shoulder twinged from the arrow graze, but he could handle the pain. Behind him, the young woman approached, ring clenched in her hand. She was breathing heavily from the climb. I want to return home. Do you know the way?" Bronn eyed her. "I came from Tyndale's Holdfast to the north. If your hamlet's near there, I can point you in the right direction. But I'm not your escort." She gulped, nodding. "I'll manage. I just needed to be sure." He gave her a curt gesture, indicating the direction. "Head that way. Follow the ridges until you see a broad orchard. Beyond that, you'll find farmland and eventually the Holdfast." "Thank you," she whispered. "I can't repay you." Bronn shook his head. "I didn't do it for you. Just watch your step. There could be stray bandits." She hugged herself, looking torn between fear and relief. Then, with a determined nod, she set off, clinging to the ring as if it were a lifeline. Bronn watched her go, uncertain if she'd survive the trek alone. But that wasn't truly his concern. He'd done enough. Once she was gone, he mounted his horse and rode back toward Tyndale's Holdfast, following the path he'd come. The sun was low, painting the ridge tops in gold. He wanted to reach the Holdfast by nightfall if possible. Present Varric's death as proof, maybe collect the meager bounty. Even if it was only a few coins, it might be enough to pay for a decent meal and a real bed. And perhaps the Castellan would offer a letter of safe passage through these lands. As twilight deepened, he emerged from the hills, finding the orchard. Fireflies flickered in the branches. The sweet scent of blossoms filled the cool air. Bronn pressed on. When he reached the Holdfast gates, the guard recognized him and waved him through. Dismounting in the muddy courtyard, he saw Ser Cleave near a brazier, conferring with 2 men-at-arms. Bronn approached, hefting his sack of loot. "Varric is dead," he announced without ceremony. Cleave blinked. "You're back already?" Bronn shrugged. "He wasn't so tough once I caught him in that ravine. Most of his men are scattered corpses now." A look of astonishment spread across Cleave's face, followed by relief. "The farmers will be safe again. You've done us a great service." "A service worth paying for?" Bronn prompted. Cleave glanced at his men, then back to Bronn. We have some coin in the coffers. Not much, mind you, but I can fetch it." Bronn followed Cleave into the keep's main hall. There, the Castellan rummaged through a battered chest, eventually producing a small pouch of silver stags, perhaps 20 in total. "Here," he said. "It's what we can spare." Bronn weighed the pouch in his hand, lips thinning. It wasn't a fortune, but combined with what he'd looted, it would suffice. "Fair enough." Cleave hesitated, then extended a hand. "I know you're just passing through, but if you ever need a place to stay, you'll be welcome here. With Varric gone, this Holdfast might prosper again." "Lord Tyndale." "Well, he's ill, but perhaps his heirs can rebuild." Bronn shook the Castellan's hand briefly. "I appreciate it." He left the hall and made for the stable, stowing his loot in saddlebags. A stable boy tried to help, but Bronn waved him off. He was anxious to secure his belongings. That night, he dined again in the main hall. This time the men-at-arms were more friendly, raising cups to him, calling him a hero for driving out the bandits. Bronn partook of the ale but left the hero talk alone. He was no hero, just a man doing a job. After supper, he strolled the courtyard for a bit, stretching his legs. The night sky was clear, stars shining overhead. He found himself reflecting on how easy it was to remove Varric's threat compared to the labyrinth struggles in King's Landing. Perhaps this was the difference between a petty bandit crew and the tangled web of power in the capital. Here, a single sword arm could make a real difference. He retired to the small storeroom for the night, placing his saddlebags within reach. Sleep came more easily this time, unburdened by labyrinth nightmares. In the morning, he rose early, deciding it was time to move on. He had coin, and he'd done Tyndale's holdfast a favor. No point lingering. Ser Cleve was in the courtyard, yawning and wiping sleep from his eyes. He nodded to Bronn. "Leaving so soon? I've got no reason to stay," Bronn replied. "Good luck to you all." Cleve scratched at his stubbled chin. "One more thing. If you cross the Mander toward Highgarden, be wary. Rumor has it the Tyrells are gathering men. Something to do with tensions in the capital. I hear the Faith Eye is pressuring them to maintain order. Not sure how it'll go." Bronn shrugged. "I'll keep that in mind. Farewell." He mounted his horse and rode out, the gates creaking shut behind him. The morning air was crisp, carrying a faint promise of warmth later. He turned northward, intending to rejoin the main road that led west toward the Gold Road. Days passed in relative peace. The roads were still muddy, but the weather improved, bringing mild sunshine. Bronn encountered few travelers and fewer troubles. He kept his loot well hidden in the saddlebags, sleeping lightly at night. Now and then, he thought back on King's Landing. News must be traveling by now of the Faith's consolidated power. Perhaps there were new upheavals, Cersei's defiance, or the Tyrells' attempts to free Marjorie, or some secret plot by Qyburn. Bronn had no desire to be part of any of it. Eventually, he reached a larger crossroads. A sign pointed west to Casterly Rock, east back to the capital, and south to Highgarden. Another sign indicated a minor route north toward the Riverlands. Bronn paused, letting the horse stand while he mulled over choices. Casterly Rock was Lannister territory. He doubted he'd receive a warm welcome, though Jaime had once been a patron. Still, with Tyrion gone, that favor might be spent. Highgarden was Tyrell territory, and from what Cleve said, House Tyrell was embroiled in uneasy tension with the Faith. He decided to head north instead, skirting the edges of the Riverlands. Maybe he could pass through the plains, eventually reach the Neck, or even cross to the Vale if it suited him. Why not? He had time, coin, and no pressing obligations. Let the Seven Kingdoms tear themselves apart if that was their destiny. So he turned north, riding through gently rolling farmland and small hamlets. The land was greener here, dotted with streams and copses of willow. Farmers labored in fields, planting or tending livestock. A sense of normalcy pervaded. These people seemed distant from the capital's turmoil. For the first time in a while, Bronn felt an odd flicker of calm, as if he could almost imagine a life free from constant schemes. Still, old habits died hard. He kept a watchful eye on everyone he passed, scanning for hidden weapons. The peace felt too fragile. Midway through his journey north, he stopped at a small town called Hillhaven. It boasted a wooden palisade, a bustling marketplace, and an inn called the Brimming Barrel. Bronn stayed there for 2 nights, enjoying the relative comfort of a real bed and decent ale. The townsfolk spoke of rumors. Some said the Ironborn were stirring again on the coasts, others whispered of dragons across the sea, and a few spoke of the Faith's ever-growing authority in the Crownlands. Bronn listened quietly, storing bits of information away. On the second evening, while nursing a cup of ale at the inn's common table, he overheard a pair of travelers discussing King's Landing. One of them, a portly man in a faded cloak, claimed that Queen Marjorie had been forced into some humiliating parade by the High Sparrow, while Tommen did nothing. Another insisted it was just a rumor. The conversation turned to speculation about the Targaryen girl across the narrow sea, about how she might soon land with Unsullied and Dothraki. Bronn paid half attention, reminding himself to stay out of major conflicts. He left Hillhaven the next morning, forging ahead through more farmland. The Riverlands lay beyond the horizon, a region often ravaged by wars. If there was unrest in the capital, it might spill into these lands yet again. He almost chuckled at the thought of stumbling upon more chaos. Everywhere in Westeros, chaos seemed to brew. In a week's time, he reached the outskirts of a larger settlement near a crossing of the Red Fork of the Trident. The town sprawled along the riverbank, protected by a stout stone wall. Traders and fishermen bustled. Bronn paused on a rise, looking down at the scene. Boats on the water, small ships at the docks. He'd never had much business in the riverlands aside from passing through. Was it worth stopping here? He was uncertain, but he needed to cross the river, and the main bridge lay within the town's walls. So he rode down, joining a line of wagons waiting to pay tolls at the gate. Guards in battered plate took coins from each traveler. When Bronn's turn came, he flipped them a copper. The guard waved him in. The street beyond was narrow, lined with wooden buildings whose upper floors jutted out overhead. The smell of fish and damp straw assaulted his nose. He wound his way through the bustling lanes, searching for the bridge. Eventually, he found it. A wide stone span arching over the broad river. More guards stood at either end, collecting a small toll. Bronn paid again, crossing to the far bank. The river shimmered in the midday sun, reflecting the sky like liquid glass. Fishing boats rocked gently. At the far side, the road led to a large open square. Stalls sold fish, vegetables, cloth, and odds and ends. People crowded around, bartering and shouting. Bronn considered stopping at a tavern for a meal, but the press of people reminded him too much of King's Landing's chaos. He decided to push onward. As he navigated the square, he spotted a group of men wearing the garb of wandering septons, rough-spun robes, bare feet, each carrying a cudgel marked with the 7-pointed star. Faith militant. They roamed the crowd, occasionally stopping to speak with townsfolk. Bronn tensed, remembering all too well his dealings with the High Sparrow. He turned his face away, pulling his hood lower. One of the Faith men happened to glance in his direction, pausing. For a moment, Bronn thought their eyes met. The man had a hawkish nose and a stern expression. He whispered something to a companion. Bronn urged his horse forward, weaving between carts. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation. He heard footsteps behind him, quickening. A voice called out, "You there, traveler? Hold a moment." Bronn grimaced and kept moving. Another voice, sharper, "Stop! In the name of the 7. People turned to stare. If he tried to gallop away through the crowded market, he might trample someone, and the Faith could incite a mob. Alternatively, if he stopped, they might recognize him as the man who'd aided the High Sparrow in the Labyrinth War, or who'd parted on ambiguous terms. That could be dangerous, especially if these zealots were more radical. He chose a middle course. He halted, turning slightly. "Something you want?" The pair of Faith militant approached. The hawk-nosed man studied him. "Have we met? You look familiar." Bronn shrugged. "Doubtful. Your face by any chance? Did you serve the High Sparrow in King's Landing?" Bronn's gut tightened. "I've been through King's Landing, like many. That doesn't mean I served the High Sparrow." The second Faith man frowned. "We have orders to keep an eye out for certain individuals. Some are wanted for questioning." "Is that so?" Bronn said, feigning ignorance. The hawk-nosed man stepped closer. "We would be remiss if we didn't verify your identity." Bronn glanced around. Dozens of townsfolk watched. Some looked nervous, others curious. The last thing he wanted was a scene that might spiral. He forced a disarming smile. "Look, friend, I'm just a Sellsword passing through. I've got no quarrel with the Faith." "Then you won't mind if we ask some questions?" the man insisted. Bronn suppressed a growl of frustration. "What kind of questions?" "Your name, your origins, your business. If all is well, we'll let you go." Bronn considered lying. He could invent a name. But if they pressed or recognized him from a prior description, the risk grew. Then again, telling the truth might be no better. The High Sparrow had said he would not impede Bronn's departure. But these zealots might have a different perspective, especially if they believed that, by leaving, Bronn had turned his back on the Faith. He made a show of sighing. "My name's Bronn. I once helped the High Sparrow in a matter of purging criminals, yes. Then I left the city with his blessing. If you doubt me, ask him yourself." The two zealots exchanged glances. The hawk-nosed one looked unconvinced. "We've heard conflicting rumors. Some say the man who helped the High Sparrow was a traitor who deserted after gaining favor." Bronn rolled his eyes. "The High Sparrow himself gave me leave to go, as far as I know. If you want proof, you can take me to him. But that's a long ride, and I doubt he wants to waste time on such nonsense." A murmur passed through the onlookers. The second faith man, less certain, shifted his stance. "Do you have any letter or token from him?" Bronn snorted. "No, I didn't ask for a farewell gift, but I'm no enemy of the faith." The hawk-nosed zealot studied him for a moment. "If what you say is true, then you did a great service for King's Landing. Still, we are duty-bound to verify. But this is not the place for a thorough examination." He gestured to the crowd, who parted warily. "Come with us to the sept in this town. We'll speak with the local father, see what can be done." Bronn's patience frayed. "I've got no time for inquisitions." The hawk-nosed man's voice hardened. "Refusing is unwise, friend. We do this for the good of your soul, to ensure no falsehood taints the faith. Or are you hiding something?" A hush fell. Bronn sensed the tension. The faith militant had grown bold, demanding compliance. If he refused, they might brand him a defiler or heretic, and the townsfolk might side with them. He had his sword, but there were two of them here, possibly more in the crowd. A pitched fight in a busy marketplace could turn lethal fast. He exhaled, feigning reluctance. "Fine, let's speak to your father, then. But let's make it quick." The hawk-nosed man nodded, relief mixing with suspicion. "Follow us." They led Bronn through the marketplace, townsfolk gawking. He kept his horse in tow, ignoring the stares. They arrived at a modest sept near the western edge of the town. A small stone building with a carved seven-pointed star above the door. A septon in brown robes was sweeping the threshold, blinking in surprise as the militant approached with a stranger. "Brother Rowan," said the hawk-nosed man. "We have a matter to discuss. This traveler claims to have served the High Sparrow. We wish to confirm his story." Brother Rowan set aside his broom. "Very well. Let us go inside." They entered a dim interior lit by a few candles. A single aisle led to an altar. Stained glass windows depicted the seven, though the glass was simple and not richly colored. The hawk-nosed man removed his hood, revealing closely cropped brown hair. He gestured for Bronn to stand before the altar, while Brother Rowan took a seat on a bench. The other zealot stood guard by the door. "Tell us your tale," Brother Rowan said gently. "How did you come to serve the High Sparrow?" Bronn's jaw tightened. He had little desire to recount the Labyrinth War in detail. "I guided his men to root out criminals beneath the city. That's all. When it was done, I left. He said I was free to go." Brother Rowan folded his hands. "The High Sparrow has been known to offer mercy and freedom to those who truly repent their sins by aiding the faith. Did you undergo penance or confession?" Bronn forced a shrug. "Confession doesn't suit me, but I helped enough that he let me walk away." The hawk-nosed zealot frowned. "And how do we know you aren't a deserter who fled justice?" Bronn's temper flared. "Look, the High Sparrow's word is the only proof I have. If you want to ride all the way back to the capital and ask him, do it. Otherwise, let me go." Brother Rowan exchanged a look with the zealot. "Perhaps we can send a raven to the Great September. See if there is any mention of a sellsword named Bronn who was granted leave." The hawk-nosed man nodded. "That might settle it. Until then, we can keep him under watch." Bronn felt his blood rise. "I'm no prisoner. Calm yourself," Brother Rowan said softly. "If your story is true, you have nothing to fear. Our Father above guides us to ensure honesty." Bronn clenched his fists, thinking this was exactly the sort of fiasco he wanted to avoid. "I've done nothing wrong. Then you can wait a few days while the raven returns," the hawk-nosed man said, crossing his arms. Bronn weighed his options. He could attempt to slip away at night, but they might post watchers. He could fight them here, but that would turn the entire town against him. If he endured this, he'd be stuck for days, maybe longer. He cursed silently. Brother Rowan sighed. We mean you no harm, truly, but we must ensure the purity of those who claim ties to the High Sparrow. He is the realm's moral compass, and we cannot have impostors tarnishing his name. Bronn eyed the door. 2 zealots blocked it, though one might slip outside and call more if things turned violent. Could he bribe them? Possibly. He reached into his pouch, pulling out a few silver stags. I've a simpler idea. Let's say I pay a donation to the September. Then we forget all this and I go on my way. Brother Rowan seemed taken aback. We do not take bribes. The hawk-nosed man's expression hardened. Insulting the faith with an attempt at bribery is a grave offense. Bronn scowled, tossing the coins at their feet. Insult or not, I'm leaving. The hawk-nosed zealot's hand went to his cudgel. You'll stay until we have clarity. Bronn's sword flashed free. He pointed the tip at the zealot. The man stepped back, startled, but raised his cudgel. The second zealot by the door drew a short sword. Brother Rowan jumped up, alarmed. In the hush, Bronn felt his pulse pound. The sept's flickering candles cast distorted shadows on the walls. He realized he stood on a knife's edge. If he shed the faith's blood in a sept, word would spread quickly. He'd be branded a heretic, hunted by zealots far and wide. But letting them hold him captive was equally intolerable. Don't be a fool, the hawk-nosed zealot warned. Bronn took a slow breath, eyes darting between them. I'll walk out peacefully, but if you try to restrain me, I'll fight. Brother Rowan lifted his hands in a placating gesture. Please let us not spill blood. Perhaps there is a compromise. No one moved. In the tense silence, the second zealot shifted, gripping his sword. You can't threaten the faith in a sacred place, he hissed. Bronn's jaw tightened. I'm not threatening your faith. I'm defending my freedom. A beat passed. Then, from outside, a muffled shout echoed. The door burst open, revealing another zealot. He panted, eyes wild. A riot in the market, he gasped. Some fishmonger refused to pay the new tithes. A fight broke out. We need help, the hawk-nosed zealot cursed, glancing at his companion. He looked to Bronn, clearly torn. Brother Rowan, watch him. We must quell the riot. Brother Rowan nodded, though he looked uneasy. The 2 zealots bolted out, leaving Rowan alone with Bronn. The septon swallowed nervously, stepping back toward the altar. Bronn lowered his sword. You won't try to hold me? Rowan hesitated. I must, but I cannot force you. I'm just a humble septon. I beg you, do not desecrate this sept with violence. Bronn realized that if he left now, no one could realistically stop him. Brother Rowan was unarmed, trembling. The other zealots would be busy in the market. This was his chance. He sheathed his sword. I'm leaving. Brother Rowan nodded quickly, relief warring with his sense of duty. May the 7 guide you to honest living. Bronn said nothing, heading for the door. Outside, the street was half deserted. Distant shouting and clashing rang from the market area. He walked briskly to where his horse was tied near the September mounting. He nudged the animal forward, weaving through back lanes to avoid the main square. Past a cluster of huts, he found a side gate. 2 guards there had abandoned their post, presumably running to the commotion. He urged the horse into a canter, slipping out of the town unnoticed. The open countryside spread before him, the sky a vibrant blue flecked with clouds. As he rode, he thought about how close he'd come to being entangled in the faith's net again. The High Sparrow might have let him go, but that didn't mean every zealot in the realm would do the same. He pressed on, determined to put many miles between himself and that town before nightfall. If the zealots tried to pursue, they'd have their hands full controlling the riot. Bronn cut across side roads, eventually rejoining a northbound track. He decided he would skirt the riverlands entirely, perhaps heading for the Vale. The Vale of Arryn was rumored to be stable, albeit insular. If that didn't suit him, he could keep going, maybe even to the north. But a man like Bronn, with a bag of gold in his saddle and a knack for survival, might thrive anywhere. He had cast off the city of King's Landing, the labyrinth's underworld, and the High Sparrow's relentless zeal. He had no illusions about heroism or devout purpose. All he wanted was the freedom to carve his own path. That was worth any price. So he continued onward, a lone rider on the twisting roads of Westeros, aware that behind him, rumors of war, faith, and rebellion brewed. The realm's great houses might clash again, or the faith might tighten its grip, or a new wave of chaos might spread from the far corners of the land. None of it truly mattered to Bronn so long as he found ways to stay a step ahead and keep gold in his pocket. Now, with the wind in his hair and the road unwinding before him, he allowed a small, private smile. The labyrinth of King's Landing was a dark memory, but he carried its lessons in every breath. He was a man who moved forward, neither saint nor sinner, just someone too clever to be caught. And as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, Bronn set his sights on whatever horizon fate might place before him, knowing that, come what may, he would remain who he had always been, a survivor unbound by any creed but his own will. And so the story unspooled across the landscape, mile after mile, day after day. In lonely glens, he gathered firewood and made camp, forging fleeting alliances with fellow travelers when it suited him, sharing a wineskin by the embers before parting ways by dawn. Occasionally, he'd hear word of shifting fortunes in King's Landing, whispers that the High Sparrow had all but enthroned the faith as the city's moral arbiter. Some travelers speculated that the Lannisters or Tyrells would eventually crush him. Others insisted the faith was unstoppable. Bronn let the rumors wash over him like the wind, uninterested in picking a side. At times, he found himself eyeing distant ridges or old ruins with the practiced awareness of a man who suspected hidden threats. Once, he encountered a group of hedge knights bickering over a map, claiming to be on a quest for some lost relic. Bronn listened with mild amusement as they bragged about glory and honor. He parted from them quickly, sure they'd find none of it. Another time, he stumbled across a roving band of mummers performing in a village square. He stayed to watch them lampoon the king and queen, then slipped away before the faith heard of their sacrilegious play. The further north he traveled, the more the land's mood changed. The nights grew colder, the roads less crowded. Local lords were distant. Their presence felt mostly through minor taxes or the occasional patrol of mounted men. Bronn found it easier to slip unnoticed through such domains. He simply paid tolls or avoided them, whichever was simpler. Eventually, he approached the outskirts of the Vale. Towering mountains loomed on the horizon, their peaks dusted with snow even in warmer seasons. The main pass into the Vale was famously guarded by the Bloody Gate, a fortress that controlled passage into the region's heart. Rumor said the Vale was under the protective watch of Lord Robin Arryn and his regent, Peter Baelish Littlefinger, as some called him. That name made Bronn uneasy. Baelish was a master of plots and cunning. If the Vale was under his sway, it might not be the peaceful haven it appeared. But the region itself was known for tranquility compared to the rest of Westeros, at least if you weren't caught in some scheme. Bronn decided to approach the Vale carefully, gleaning information from travelers. Many said the Vale's gates were open to merchants, but heavily monitored. If Bronn was asked to state his purpose, he could claim to be a trader or mercenary seeking work. With winter approaching in the north, the Vale might have tasks for a skilled sword. Or perhaps he could find a remote corner, buy a small plot of land, and vanish from the world's meddling. The idea sounded almost laughable. Bronn as a quiet landowner? Yet part of him found the notion appealing. He pressed on, the foothills growing steeper. One afternoon, he paused on a rocky overlook, letting his horse graze. The sky stretched wide, a crisp blue, and far off he could see the narrow pass that led to the Bloody Gate. Tiny figures moved along the road. Merchants, knights, who could say? He took a drink from his waterskin, pondering the next move. A few hours later, he descended into a forested vale. The path twisted between tall pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft hush. The sun slanted through the branches. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Hold there, friend." Bronn reined his horse, heart thumping. He saw a man step from behind a tree, a longbow in hand, arrow notched but not fully drawn. Another figure emerged to the left, similarly armed. Both wore leather jerkins with no heraldic sigils. Outlaws? Or local guards in plain clothes? The first man spoke again. "You traveling to the Vale?" Bronn eyed him warily. "Might be. We've a toll for this road," the man said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "5 silver stags, or we turn you away." Bronn gave a dry chuckle. "I've paid enough tolls in this realm. What lord do you serve?" The man shrugged. "We serve ourselves. Coin or your horse, those are your choices." "Definitely outlaws, then." Bronn sized them up, 2 archers, possibly more hidden. He glanced around discreetly. The pine forest was thick, offering cover. If there were more men, they might be flanking him. He considered paying just to avoid trouble, but old instincts rebelled. He was no helpless merchant. 5 silver stags is a steep price," he said, loosening his sword in the scabbard. "How about 2? The second archer sneered. "This isn't a haggle. Pay or bleed." Bronn sighed theatrically. "Then I'll choose bleed for you." Before they could react, he spurred his horse forward, sword flashing free. The first archer tried to draw and fire, but he was too slow. Bronn ducked in the saddle, letting the arrow sail overhead, then slashed across the archer's chest. The man cried out, stumbling back. The second archer loosed an arrow that grazed the horse's flank, causing it to whinny in pain. Bronn clenched his knees, forcing the animal to keep running. Then he wheeled around, bearing down on the second archer, who fumbled for another arrow. Bronn's sword struck the bow aside, then cleaved downward, biting into the man's shoulder. A third outlaw sprang from behind a tree, short sword raised. Bronn saw him in the corner of his vision, tugging the reins to pivot. The short sword whistled past, nicking Bronn's sleeve. He kicked the man in the ribs, toppling him, then lunged with a swift stab to the chest. The outlaw's eyes rolled back. Bronn dismounted, scanning for more threats. The first archer lay on the ground, clutching his chest wound. The second was on his knees, blood streaming from his shoulder. Bronn advanced, pointing his sword. The wounded archer glared. "You fight well for a traveler," he spat. Bronn shrugged. "I've fought bigger fools than you." He glanced at the horse. An arrow was lodged in its flank, but not deeply. That angered him. He hated losing a good mount to petty bandits. He approached the second archer. "Why not pick an easier mark next time?" Then he slammed the pommel against the man's head, knocking him unconscious. The first archer was barely breathing, eyes unfocused. Bronn knelt, rummaging the man's pockets. He found a few coins, a dagger. He took them. He doubted the bandit would survive. Then he moved to the unconscious archer, doing the same. A pitiful haul, but maybe it was enough to pay for a salve for his horse's wound. He turned to the fallen body of the third outlaw, retrieving a small purse of coppers. Another worthless yield. "Shame," he muttered. "At least you can't rob anyone else." Bronn exhaled, mind returning to the horse's injury. He moved gently to the animal's side. The arrow protruded near the haunch, blood trickling. He murmured soothing words, then carefully snapped the arrow shaft. The horse shivered. He'd need to remove the arrowhead and clean the wound. He led the horse a short distance, searching for a small clearing, and found a trickling stream. There, he set to work, applying what meager skill he had in tending wounds. He poured water over the arrow shaft, then used his dagger to probe gently. The horse whinnied, stomping a hoof. After a tense moment, Bronn extracted the arrowhead. Blood oozed, but not heavily. He tore a strip of cloth from an old rag, binding it around the wound. The horse pawed the ground, anxious. "Easy," Bronn said, patting its neck. "Could have been worse." He let the horse rest, letting it drink from the stream. Meanwhile, he kept an ear out for more outlaws. None came. The forest was quiet, the day creeping toward dusk. When he resumed travel, he had to go slowly, mindful of the horse's limp. By twilight, he found a campsite under a rocky overhang. He made a small fire, heated some water to clean the horse's wound again. Then he settled for a cold supper of bread and cheese, saving his meager ration of salted beef. Exhaustion weighed on him. The outlaws, the faith zealots, the labyrinth of King's Landing. He felt like he had been running from conflict after conflict, never truly free. Yet, as the fire crackled in the silent forest, he reminded himself that this was still better than the city's shackles. No high Sparrow loomed over him, no labyrinth walls closed in. He had gold, he had a horse, albeit wounded, and he had the open road. That was more than many could claim. He dreamed fitfully of the labyrinth once more, Crisp the rat's mocking grin merging with the hawk-nosed zealot's face. In the dream, corridors twisted upward into a sept's vaulted ceiling, where candelabras swung menacingly. Bronn found himself cornered by robed figures chanting, "Confess, confess," while Crisp cackled from behind. He woke with a start, cursing softly. Morning brought a chill. Bronn checked the horse's wound, relieved to see it hadn't festered. He gave the animal a gentle pat, stowed his gear, and continued on. The forest thinned as he climbed higher into the foothills. By midday, he reached a vantage point that overlooked a winding valley leading toward the mountains. A signpost pointed east toward the Bloody Gate. Another path branched north, presumably skirting the vale entirely. He paused, considering. The vale might offer safety, but also potential entanglement if Baelish or other lords recognized him. Meanwhile, heading north into the Riverlands might lead to trouble with the Freys or other houses. But that route at least avoided direct oversight. A gull called overhead, oddly out of place in the mountains. Bronn traced its flight, thinking about the sea. Perhaps he should head to the coast, catch a ship to the free cities, and vanish among the Sellsword companies of Essos. He had coin, and the Labyrinth War had taught him that anywhere might be better than a realm beset by fanatics. The notion of crossing the narrow sea was strangely appealing. Yet he lingered, uncertain. In the end, he decided to try the Vale. The road to the Bloody Gate was better traveled. If he found it too fraught with politics, he could always turn around or slip away. So he turned east, guiding his horse carefully down a winding path, the mountains rising ahead. Over the next days, he passed through scenic valleys, sheer cliffs, and swift rivers. The road was well maintained in places, treacherous in others. The closer he got to the Bloody Gate, the more frequently he saw small patrols of Vale Knights, wearing the sigil of House Arryn or other local houses. None bothered him much. He paid the tolls or answered politely when asked his business, claiming to be a wandering Sellsword looking for honest labor in the Vale. At last, the imposing shape of the Bloody Gate came into view. Two stout towers stood on either side of a narrow pass, connected by a wall overhead. Archers manned the battlements, watchful of all who approached. Bronn joined a small caravan of merchants heading the same way, blending in to avoid scrutiny. When they reached the gate, a knight in Arryn colors emerged, flanked by men-at-arms. The merchant in front provided documentation, explaining they brought grain and cloth. Then it was Bronn's turn. "Name and purpose in the Vale?" the knight demanded, polite but firm. "Bronn, I'm a traveling Sellsword, hoping to find work, or maybe a quiet place to spend my coin." The knight studied him. "Any trouble with the law?" "Not that I'm aware of." The knight nodded curtly. "Stay out of mischief. Lord Baelish wants stability." Bronn raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The men-at-arms stepped aside, letting him pass under the arch of the gate. He felt a sense of relief as he entered the Vale proper, a region famed for its picturesque mountains and fertile valleys. Perhaps here he might finally enjoy some respite from the swirl of conflict. He rode along the high road, marveling at the dramatic scenery, towering peaks, cascading waterfalls, pockets of lush farmland nestled in the valleys. The air felt colder, fresher. Villages perched on hills, each with a small sept or shrine. He spent a few nights at roadside inns, noticing that the Vale seemed calmer than the rest of Westeros. Locals spoke of Lord Baelish's influence, how he balanced alliances and kept the Knights of the Vale unbloodied in most recent conflicts. Some praised him, others doubted his sincerity. Bronn simply listened, content to remain a faceless outsider. He had no illusions. Baelish was cunning. If he got wind of a notable sellsword in the Vale with ties to the Lannisters or the Faith, he might try to recruit or manipulate him. Bronn resolved to keep a low profile. After a week in the Vale, he reached a crossroads near a settlement called Heart's Home, seat of House Corbray. Beyond lay the path to the Eyrie, the Arryn stronghold perched atop a mountain. Bronn had no desire to climb that fortress. Instead, he heard rumors of smaller towns deeper in the foothills, where a man could live quietly. So he turned away from Heart's Home, riding toward a less traveled region of the Vale. The land grew wilder again, the road narrower. He passed farms and hamlets, all overshadowed by the looming mountains. Streams flowed down rocky channels. Now and then he glimpsed goats perched on ledges. One evening, he reached a secluded valley with a single village hugging a lakeshore. Smoke rose from chimneys, and a small watchtower stood on a hill overlooking the water. Bronn asked a passing shepherd the name. "Wyvern Hollow," the man said. "Small place, but they welcome travelers." Bronn rode down the gentle slope, thinking it looked peaceful enough. The lake reflected the pink and orange of the setting sun. A few fishing boats floated near the shore. Stone cottages lined a dirt street. No signs of knights, no signs of the faith. He almost smiled. This might be a decent place to pause for a while. He found an inn near the lakeshore, a squat building with a wooden sign proclaiming the Crystal Ford. Inside, a kindly middle-aged couple ran the place, greeting him warmly. He took a room for a few coppers, grateful for the quiet. The common room was small but cozy, a fire crackling in the hearth. A handful of villagers sat at a table, sharing local gossip. Bronn ordered a meal of fish stew and bread, better than he expected, fresh from the lake. Over the next few days, he settled into an unaccustomed routine. Each morning, he'd awaken to the call of lake birds, have a simple breakfast, then wander the village or the lakeshore. He found an old fisherman willing to rent him a boat for a few coppers, and he rowed out on the still waters, letting the crisp air clear his mind. He kept his sword in the boat, half expecting an ambush, but none came. The folk of Wyvern Hollow seemed uninterested in trouble. Now and then, he'd practice sword drills on the lakeshore to keep his skills sharp. Curious children watched from a distance, giggling when he swung in arcs or lunged at imaginary foes. He'd ignore them, or sometimes offer a half-smile if they got too close. He thought about Crisp the rat, the labyrinth, and the high sparrow less and less. The nightmares receded, replaced by the gentle hush of lake water and the rustle of pine trees. He stayed for a fortnight, paying the innkeeper with coins gleaned from Varric's hoard. The villagers grew accustomed to him, greeting him as Ser, even though he insisted he wasn't a knight. A local blacksmith sharpened his blade for a small fee. Another fellow offered to buy the jeweled dagger he carried, but Bronn kept it as a reminder of his days in the labyrinth. One day, a traveling merchant passed through, bearing spices and trinkets. He carried news from the realm. The Faith militant continued to tighten its grip in King's Landing. The Tyrells chafed at the restrictions, and tensions were high. Some rumored that Cersei Lannister was conspiring to undermine the High Sparrow by any means necessary, but the details were murky. The merchant also mentioned skirmishes in the Riverlands, where the Freys demanded fealty from reluctant lords. None of it seemed to impact Wyvern Hollow, at least not yet. Bronn felt a strange contentment he hadn't known in years, but part of him remained on edge, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Peace was rare in Westeros, and he doubted he could linger indefinitely. Even so, he let himself enjoy the lull. If the day came when trouble arrived, he'd be ready to move on, as always. Yet trouble has a way of finding those unaccustomed to rest. On the morning of his 15th day in Wyvern Hollow, he noticed a pair of strangers in the village square. Two young men on horses, wearing chainmail under travel-stained cloaks. Their faces looked grim, and they asked the villagers questions. Bronn, leaning against a cottage wall, watched them quietly. He sensed the tension. Eventually, the strangers rode to the inn. Bronn slipped inside after them, taking a seat in a corner. The innkeeper approached the men. "Welcome, travelers. Rooms or ale?" One of them, who had a thin mustache, said, "We're looking for a sellsword named Bronn. Dark hair, rough manners. Word is he traveled east. Has he come through here?" Bronn tensed. So someone was searching for him. The innkeeper hesitated, glancing at Bronn in the corner. Bronn gave a small shake of his head, signaling not to say anything. "He might have," the innkeeper said carefully. "What business do you have with him?" The second stranger spoke, voice tight. "He's wanted for questioning by the faith militant. We have orders from the High Sparrow to locate him and bring him back to the capital." Bronn's pulse pounded. The High Sparrow? So the old man's promise not to impede him might have been overruled or twisted by others in the faith. Possibly these were roving zealot agents or bounty hunters in the faith's employ. Either way, they meant trouble. The innkeeper forced a polite smile. "I'm afraid I haven't seen such a man." The strangers exchanged a look. "We'll search the village ourselves," the mustached one said. "If you're lying, there will be consequences." They turned to leave. Bronn remained in the corner, hood shadowing his face. As soon as the strangers stepped outside, he stood, cursing under his breath. The innkeeper scurried over, fretful. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say." Bronn shook his head. "It's all right. I appreciate you covering for me, but I can't stay here." The man wrung his hands. "If they cause trouble, I'll be gone before they can. They won't trouble you if I'm not here." He ducked upstairs to his room, quickly gathering his belongings into saddlebags. The quiet life, it seemed, was over. The faith, or those allied with it, had tracked him down. They might have gleaned his direction from the fiasco in that Riverlands town, or from some other rumor. Perhaps the High Sparrow's tolerance had limits, or zealots had simply taken matters into their own hands. Within minutes, Bronn was saddling his horse behind the inn, scanning for any sign of the strangers. He heard voices in the distance, the men questioning a villager. No time to linger. He mounted up and trotted around the back of the cottages, heading for a narrow track that wound up into the mountains. Once out of sight, he urged the horse to a canter, ignoring the twinge in its flank. He fled Wyvern Hollow with a tightness in his chest, a resigned sense that peace was fleeting. The faith had not forgotten him, or at least some faction of it wanted him brought back. He might outrun these men, but they could send more. Rumors traveled, and the Vale might not remain safe. That night, he camped in a high meadow, shivering in the cold. He lit no fire, wary of being spotted. The stars seemed distant and cold. His mind churned with anger toward the High Sparrow. The old man had promised no harm, but evidently, the faith's zealots were a law unto themselves. Or maybe the High Sparrow had changed his mind. In the morning, he pressed deeper into the mountains, following goat trails that twisted around crags. The slope grew treacherous, the air thinner. The horse struggled, but Bronn pushed onward. He had no illusions about crossing the mountains of the moon easily, but if it meant evading pursuers, he'd risk it. After 2 days of hard travel, he descended into another valley, the route remote and barely marked. He encountered no one. The shadows of the peaks loomed, ominous. At the valley's far side, a path turned north again, leading him closer to the edge of the Vale. Perhaps from there, he could slip into the mountains bordering the Bight, or find a pass that led to the north. The north might be even harsher, but at least the faith had less reach there, other than the northern houses with their own concerns. So he rode on, battered by wind and haunted by the realization that King's Landing's labyrinth might be gone. But the network of the faith and its minions reached far beyond the city walls. If they wanted him badly enough, they might hound him across the 7 kingdoms. Yet as the days wore on, and the mountains gave way to rough hills, he found no immediate sign of pursuit. Perhaps those 2 men had lost his trail, or perhaps they'd circle around to more traveled routes. Bronn planned to stick to back roads, avoiding towns. He'd hunt small game, rest under the stars. As lo,